Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to tonight's story. I'm so glad you've decided to join me on this journey into mystery and intrigue. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Perhaps you're tucked into bed in a cozy apartment in the city, or maybe you're in a quiet house in the suburbs with rain pattering gently against your windows. What time is it where you are? Is it that perfect drowsy hour when the world grows quiet and still? Wherever you are, whatever time it may be, you're exactly where you need to be for tonight's tale. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your breathing slow as we embark on a story that will carry you through the night like a gentle stream. Tonight, I want to tell you about the disappearance of Margaret Whitmore, a case that unfolded in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls in the autumn of 1987. It's a story of secrets whispered through pine trees, of a community bound by silence, and of one woman whose vanishing would change everything. The investigation that followed would reveal that sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't solved with dramatic revelations, but with the quiet persistence of truth slowly rising to the surface. Like morning mist lifting from a still lake dot, so close your eyes if you'd like. Let your shoulders relax and allow me to transport you to a place where time moves differently, where the air smells of evergreen and wood smoke, and where a mystery waits to unfold as gently as twilight falling across the mountains. Asterisk in the autumn of 1987, Cedar Falls was the kind of town that existed in the spaces between other places. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pine forests, it was home to just over 3,000 souls who had chosen, for various reasons, to make their lives in this pocket of tranquility far from the rushing world beyond the mountains. Town had grown up around a lumber mill that had been running since 1923, its steady rhythm marking the days like a great wooden heart beating in the center of the community. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, lined with the kinds of businesses that had remained unchanged for decades. Murphy's General Store, where you could still buy penny candy from glass jars. The Cedar Falls Diner, famous throughout the county for their apple pie. And Whitmore's Bookshop, a narrow building squeezed between the hardware store and the post office, its windows always glowing with warm yellow light. Margaret Whitmore had owned the bookshop for 15 years. Ever since she'd arrived in Cedar Falls as a young woman of 28, carrying nothing but a suitcase full of books and a heart full of secrets she'd never shared with anyone. She had purchased the failing stationery store from old Mr. Henderson. With money she'd saved from her previous life, a life she spoke of rarely and in the vaguest terms. "I worked in the city," she would say when anyone asked, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent no one could quite place. "But I always knew I belonged somewhere quieter." Margaret was the kind of woman who moved through the world, like she was listening to music only she could hear. She had silver-streaked brown hair that she kept pulled back in a loose bun, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her years. She dressed simply, but with an elegance that suggested she had once lived very differently. Soft sweaters in muted colors, well-tailored skirts, and shoes that had been expensive once upon a time. The bookshop became the heart of Cedar Falls, in ways that even Margaret hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a place to buy books, though she kept an impressive selection for such a small town. It was a gathering place, a sanctuary, a spot where the lonely could find company and the curious could find answers to questions they hadn't even known they were asking. Margaret had an uncanny ability to match books to people. Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's widow, had been struggling with insomnia since her husband's death, until Margaret pressed a worn copy of The Wind in the Willows into her hands. "Sometimes," Margaret had said softly, "we need stories that remind us that home can be anywhere we choose to make it." Young Tommy Morrison, who struggled with reading, found confidence through the gentle encouragement Margaret offered, along with carefully selected adventure stories that captured his imagination. She never made him feel ashamed of his difficulties, instead celebrating each book he finished as if he'd climbed a mountain. Even Sheriff Daniel Garrett, A practical man who claimed he didn't have time for book learning found himself stopping by the shop regularly, drawn by Margaret's ability to recommend mysteries that kept him guessing until the final page. Their conversations about plot twists and red herrings became a weekly ritual that both looked forward to, though neither would have admitted it. But perhaps most importantly, the bookshop was where Margaret seemed most herself. Away from the gentle scrutiny of small-town life, surrounded by stories and the soft scent of aging paper, she moved with a purpose and peace that transformed her. Customers would often comment that she seemed to glow in that space, as if the books themselves were charging her with some invisible energy. The autumn of 1987 had been particularly beautiful in Cedar Falls. The maples that lined Elm Street had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Margaret had been preparing for the shop's busiest season, the long winter months, when people hungered for stories to carry them through the darkness. She had recently received a large shipment of books from a distributor in Portland, and spent her evenings after closing time cataloging and shelving the new arrivals. It was peaceful work that she genuinely enjoyed, made even more pleasant by the classical music she played softly in the background and the cup of chamomile tea that had become her evening ritual. On the surface, Margaret's life appeared to be exactly what she had built it to be: quiet, meaningful, and safely predictable. But beneath that carefully constructed peace, there were currents running that no one in Cedar Falls fully understood. There were the letters that arrived once a month, always in elegant cream-colored envelopes with no return address, that made Margaret's face pale when she retrieved them from her post office box. There were the occasional phone calls that came to the shop, conversations conducted in voices so low that even Betty Morrison, who worked part-time helping with inventory, couldn't make out the words. Asterisk, and there were Margaret's trips to Portland, which she took every few months, always returning with new books, but also with a drawn, exhausted expression that would take days to fade. When asked about these trips, she would smile and deflect. Just business, nothing exciting. You know how tedious dealing with distributors can be. Most tellingly, there were the nights when insomnia would drive Margaret from her small apartment above the bookshop to walk the empty streets of Cedar Falls until dawn. Sheriff Garrett had noticed her on these walks during his late-night patrols, a solitary figure moving through pools of streetlight like a ghost searching for something she couldn't name. But in a town like Cedar Falls, people respected privacy. Everyone had their secrets, their reasons for choosing a life away from the complications of the larger world. As long as those secrets didn't harm anyone else, they were allowed to remain buried beneath the surface of daily life. This understanding, this gentle conspiracy of silence, was what made Cedar Falls feel safe for people like Margaret. It was also what would make her disappearance so much more mysterious and disturbing when it finally came. The last completely normal day of Margaret's life was Thursday, October 15th, 1987. She had opened the shop at 9 in the morning, as she had every day for 15 years. The autumn light streaming through her windows was golden and warm, and she had arranged a display of cozy mysteries near the front door, thinking that people would want comfort reads as the weather grew colder. Betty Morrison had worked her usual shift from 2 to 6, helping customers and processing the new inventory. They had talked about ordinary things, the weather, plans for the upcoming Halloween festival, a particularly good apple cake recipe that Margaret wanted to try, asterisk, at closing time. Margaret had walked Betty to the door, as she always did, turning the wooden sign from open to closed, and sliding the bolt home with the solid, satisfying click that marked the end of another peaceful day. "See you Saturday, dear," Margaret had called after Betty, who was already halfway down the sidewalk, hurrying home to start dinner for her family. "See you Saturday," Betty had called back, not knowing that she never would. That evening, Margaret had followed her usual routine. She made herself a simple dinner of soup and bread, which she ate while reading at her small kitchen table. She had recently started The Secret Garden, a book she reread every few years when she was feeling particularly nostalgic. After dinner, she put on her favorite Miles Davis album and settled in the shop to work on cataloging the new arrivals. Asterisk. Everything about that evening was exactly as it should have been. The music was soothing, the work was satisfying, and the chamomile tea she sipped as she worked filled her with the kind of gentle contentment that had become the foundation of her life in Cedar Falls. At some point during that quiet evening, Margaret Whitmore stepped out of her ordinary life and into a mystery that would consume the town for months to come. When the morning came, she was simply gone. Friday morning arrived in Cedar Falls with the kind of crystalline clarity that mountain towns know in October. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the earthy smell of leaves beginning their slow return to the soil. It should have been a perfect day. At 9 o'clock, when Margaret's bookshop should have opened, the closed sign remained turned inward and the door stayed locked. This was unusual enough that several regular customers noticed immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who stopped by every Friday to browse the new arrivals, stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, checking her watch and peering through the windows, as if Margaret might simply be running late. "Perhaps she's feeling under the weather," Mrs. Patterson murmured to herself, though even as she said it, she couldn't remember Margaret ever being sick, not once in all the years she'd been coming to the shop. By 10:30, when the shop still showed no signs of life, concern began to ripple through the small community. Tom Murphy, whose general store was directly across the street, had been keeping an eye on things all morning. He knew Margaret's routine as well as anyone. She was punctual to a fault, opening at 9 and closing at 6, Monday through Saturday, every week without exception. "Something's not right," he told his wife, Helen, who was helping him stock the shelves with canned goods. "Margaret's never late, never sick. In 15 years, I've never seen that shop closed when it should be open." Helen Murphy was a practical woman who didn't believe in borrowing trouble, but she had to admit that Tom was right. Margaret's reliability was legendary in Cedar Falls. People set their watches by the sound of her door opening each morning, the gentle chime of the bell announcing the start of another day. "Maybe we should check on her," Helen suggested. She could be upstairs feeling poorly and just lost track of time. Tom nodded and crossed the street, his footsteps echoing in the unusually quiet morning air. The bookshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow 2-story building, with Margaret's apartment upstairs. Tom knocked on the shop door first, calling out, "Margaret, you all right in there?" No response. He tried the side door that led to the apartment stairs, knocking more loudly and calling Margaret's name again. Still nothing. The building seemed to absorb sound, holding its silence like a secret. Growing more concerned, Tom walked around to the alley behind the building, where Margaret kept her car, a modest blue Honda Civic that she had driven carefully and maintained meticulously since purchasing it in 1985. The car was gone. This should have been reassuring. If Margaret's car was missing, then surely she had simply gone somewhere, perhaps to Portland on unexpected business, or to visit someone who was ill. But somehow, the empty parking space only deepened the sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Tom returned to his store and called Sheriff Daniel Garrett, who listened to his concerns with the patient attention he gave to all of his citizens' worries, no matter how small they might seem. "I'll come by and take a look," Sheriff Garrett promised. Could be she had some kind of family emergency and had to leave town quickly. Happens sometimes. But as Sheriff Garrett hung up the phone, he felt a chill of unease that had nothing to do with the October weather. In his 8 years of law enforcement in Cedar Falls, he had learned to trust his instincts. And right now those instincts were telling him that Margaret Whitmore's absence was not routine. Sheriff Garrett was a methodical man who approached problems The way Margaret approached matching books to customers carefully, thoughtfully, with attention to details that others might overlook. He had grown up in Cedar Falls, left for college and a brief stint in the Army, then returned to serve his community with the kind of quiet dedication that went largely unnoticed, but was deeply appreciated. He was also, though he would never have admitted it, somewhat protective of Margaret Whitmore. Not in any inappropriate way, he was happily married to his college sweetheart, Sarah, and they had 2 teenage children who kept them both busy. But there was something about Margaret's careful reserve, her obvious intelligence, and the sadness that sometimes flickered in her storm-gray eyes that had always made him want to ensure that she was safe and unmolested in the life she had built. For herself, when Sheriff Garrett arrived at the bookshop, a small crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, and by noon, most of the town knew that something unusual was happening. Betty Morrison stood with her husband, Jim, both of them looking worried and confused. Several other regular customers had arrived for their usual browsing and now clustered on the sidewalk, speaking in the kind of hushed tones that people use when something has disrupted the natural order of their world. Sheriff Garrett examined the shop door and windows carefully, looking for any signs of forced entry or disturbance. Everything appeared normal. The door was securely locked, and through the windows, the interior of the shop looked exactly as it should, books neatly arranged, the cash register closed, chairs positioned around the small reading area that Margaret had created near the back of the store. "Has anyone tried calling her?" he asked the gathered crowd. "I tried about an hour ago," Betty Morrison said. "No answer upstairs or at the shop. The phone just rings and rings." Sheriff Garrett nodded and made his way to the apartment entrance. He knocked loudly and called Margaret's name, then tried the door. It was locked, as expected. From his belt, he removed a small ring of keys that included master keys for most of the commercial buildings in town, a practical necessity in a small community where emergencies sometimes required quick access. Asterisk, "I'm going to check upstairs. Make sure she's not ill or injured," he announced to the crowd. "Everyone stay down here, please." The apartment stairs were narrow and creaked under Sheriff Garrett's weight. At the top, he found a small landing with a single door painted pale blue. He knocked once more, calling Margaret's name, then used his key to enter. Margaret's apartment was as neat and thoughtfully arranged as her bookshop, but much more personal. The living room was filled with comfortable, well-worn furniture and lined with bookshelves that held what appeared to be Margaret's private collection books she kept for herself rather than for sale. Classical music albums were stacked next to a high-quality stereo system, and the walls were decorated with watercolor paintings of landscapes that looked European. Though Sheriff Garrett couldn't identify the specific locations, everything appeared normal, undisturbed, as if Margaret had simply stepped out temporarily. But as Sheriff Garrett moved through the apartment, that sense of rawness only grew stronger. In the bedroom, Margaret's bed was neatly made with the kind of precision that suggested military training or simply a deeply ingrained habit of order. Her clothes hung in the closet with careful organization: work clothes, casual clothes, and what appeared to be several very expensive outfits that looked like they hadn't been worn in years. The bathroom yielded the first real clue that something was amiss. Margaret's toothbrush, hairbrush, and other daily necessities were all present. If she had left town on a planned trip, surely she would have taken at least the basics with her. But it was the kitchen that provided the most disturbing evidence. On the counter, Sheriff Garrett found a cup of tea, cold and with a film of milk on the surface that suggested it had been sitting undisturbed for many hours. Next to the cup was a book, The Secret Garden, open to page 127, with a bookmark lying beside it as if it had fallen out. This was clearly Margaret's evening tea, part of her ritual that everyone in town knew about. She had been reading, had set down her bookmark for some reason, and then, gone somewhere without finishing her tea. Left without closing her book? It was completely out of character. Sheriff Garrett spent another 20 minutes searching the apartment, looking for any other clues to Margaret's whereabouts. He found her purse in the bedroom, containing her wallet, credit cards, and about $40 in cash. Her checkbook showed no unusual activity, and a quick look at her calendar revealed no appointments or plans that would explain an unexpected departure. By the time he returned downstairs, the crowd on the sidewalk had grown. News of Margaret's disappearance was spreading through Cedar Falls like ripples across a pond, and people were beginning to gather not just out of curiosity, but out of genuine concern for a woman who had become an integral part of their community. "What did you find?" Tom Murphy asked as soon as Sheriff Garrett emerged from the building. "No sign of her," Sheriff Garrett replied carefully, "but no sign of trouble either. Her car's gone, but she left her purse behind. Could still be some kind of emergency." Even as he said it, though, Sheriff Garrett knew he didn't believe it. His 8 years in law enforcement, preceded by 29 years of living in Cedar Falls, had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was genuinely wrong. And every instinct he possessed was telling him that Margaret Whitmore had not left town voluntarily. Asterisk. The afternoon brought more disturbing discoveries. A call to the local hospital confirmed that Margaret had not been admitted or treated. Calls to nearby towns yielded no sightings of her or her car. Most troubling of all, when Sheriff Garrett contacted Margaret's bank in Portland, he learned that she had not accessed her account in any way since the previous Tuesday. As evening approached and the autumn darkness began to settle over Cedar Falls, Sheriff Garrett found himself standing in Margaret's empty bookshop, surrounded by thousands of stories, but unable to piece together the beginning of the real story. That mattered most. Where was Margaret Whitmore? What had happened in the quiet hours of the previous evening to make her abandon her carefully ordered life? And why did her absence feel less like a departure and more like an erasure, as if she had been gently but completely removed from the world she had made her home? The questions multiplied in the gathering darkness, but the answers remained as elusive as morning mist rising from the valley floor. Asterisk. By Saturday morning, Margaret Whitmore's disappearance had taken on the quality of a stone thrown into still water. The initial splash had occurred, and now the ripples were spreading outward, disturbing the calm surface of life in Cedar Falls in ways both obvious and subtle. Sheriff Garrett had spent a sleepless Friday night making phone calls and filling out the preliminary paperwork for a missing person case. He had contacted the state police, though they wouldn't become actively involved unless evidence suggested foul play, or if Margaret remained missing for longer than 48 hours. He had also reached out to police departments in Portland and other larger cities, asking them to be alert for a blue Honda Civic with Oregon plates, but it was the calls he couldn't make that troubled him most. Margaret had no emergency contact on file with the bank, the post office, or any of the other institutions she dealt with regularly. As far as any official records showed, she existed in isolation, no family, no close friends outside of Cedar Falls, no connections to a life beyond the boundaries of their small mountain town. This was unusual enough that Sheriff Garrett found himself questioning things about Margaret that he had never thought to wonder about before. How had a woman with no apparent family or history come to own a bookshop at the age of 28? Where had the money come from? And why, in 15 years of living in one of the most tightly knit communities in Oregon, had she managed to remain so essentially mysterious? The morning brought a steady stream of visitors to the sheriff's office, each one wanting to help, to share information, or simply to express their concern. Betty Morrison arrived first, clutching a manila folder filled with papers. "I brought everything I could think of," she said, settling into the chair across from Sheriff Garrett's desk. "Work schedules, order forms, anything that might help you figure out where she went." Betty had worked for Margaret for 3 years ever since Her youngest child had started school, and she'd needed something to fill the quiet hours. She was a conscientious employee and had genuinely liked Margaret, though she had to admit that their relationship had remained friendly but not deeply personal. Asterisk, she was private, Betty explained, smoothing the papers with nervous fingers. Not unfriendly, just careful about what she shared. I know she read voraciously, loved classical music, and made the most amazing chamomile tea. But I couldn't tell you her birthday, or where she grew up, or if she'd ever been married. Sheriff Garrett nodded, making notes as Betty spoke. This matched his own observations about Margaret, warm but reserved, engaged with the community, but somehow separate from it. Did she ever mention family? He asked. Anyone she might go to in an emergency? Betty shook her head. Never. I asked her once about Thanksgiving plans, and she just said she preferred quiet holidays. I invited her to join our family, but she declined politely, said she had her own traditions. What about those trips to Portland? Did she ever talk about who she met there? Only in the most general terms. Business meetings with distributors, she said. But Betty hesitated, then continued. A few times when she came back, she seemed different. Shaken, maybe? Like something had upset her. When I asked if everything was all right, she'd just smile and change the subject. After Betty left, Sheriff Garrett received a visit from Father Michael O'Connor, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Father O'Connor was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had served the spiritual needs of Cedar Falls for over 20 years. He had a gift for seeing the hidden struggles of his parishioners and a gentle way of offering support without judgment. No, Margaret wasn't Catholic, Father O'Connor said, settling his tall frame into the chair that Betty had recently vacated. But she occasionally attended our evening prayer services. Always sat in the back, never stayed to socialize, but there was something about her presence that was peaceful, reverent. Did she ever speak to you personally? Sheriff Garrett asked asterisk. Once, Father O'Connor replied, his voice thoughtful. It was about 6 months ago. She approached me after a service and asked if I believed that people could truly start over, that past mistakes could be forgiven and forgotten. I told her that I believed in redemption, that God's grace was sufficient for any burden. She thanked me and left, but I could see that my answer both comforted and troubled her. Troubled her how? As if she wanted to believe what I'd said, but couldn't quite allow herself to accept it. There are people who carry guilt like a weight, Sheriff. Margaret struck me as one of those people. The priest's words stayed with Sheriff Garrett long after the man had left. What kind of guilt could a quiet bookshop owner in a small mountain town be carrying? And could that guilt be connected to her disappearance? The afternoon brought more pieces of the puzzle, though they only served to make the overall picture more confusing. Dr. Sarah Chun, who ran the town's small medical clinic, confirmed that Margaret had been a patient, but had never mentioned family medical history or emergency contacts. She was remarkably healthy, Dr. Chun reported. Very conscientious about preventive care, but she always paid in cash and seemed reluctant to provide detailed personal information. I always assumed she was just particularly private. Tom and Helen Murphy stopped by to share their observations from 15 years of being Margaret's neighbors across the street. They had noticed her routines, her occasional late-night walks, and the way she seemed to relax only when she was in her bookshop. She loved that place, Helen Murphy said. You could see it in the way she moved around it, arranging the books, helping customers. It was like watching someone tend a garden they'd planted with their own hands. But she never seemed completely at peace, Tom added. Even when she was smiling and chatting with customers, there was always something watchful about her. Like she was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. Asterisk as the day wore on, Sheriff Garrett found himself with a detailed portrait of Margaret Whitmore's life in Cedar Falls, but virtually no information about who she had been before arriving there. It was as if she had materialized fully formed in 1972, complete with enough money to buy a business and the skills to run it successfully, but without any of the personal history that normally followed people from place to place. The most intriguing lead came from an unexpected source. Jenny Martinez, who worked at the post office, had been thinking about Margaret's mail patterns ever since hearing about the disappearance. She got regular letters from a law office in San Francisco, Jenny revealed, though she was clearly uncomfortable sharing information about postal customers. Came every month like clockwork, always made her nervous when they arrived. And she got letters from someone in Portland too, but those were different personal letters in cream-colored envelopes with no return address. Sheriff Garrett made careful notes about both types of correspondence. Legal matters from San Francisco suggested some ongoing business or financial arrangement. Personal letters from Portland with no return address suggested a relationship that someone wanted to keep private. By Sunday evening, Sheriff Garrett had filled 3 notebooks with information about Margaret's life and disappearance, but he felt no closer to understanding what had happened to her. The state police had officially taken over the case, and Detective Ray Morrison, no relation to Betty and Jim Morrison, would arrive from Salem on Monday morning to begin a more formal investigation. That night, Sheriff Garrett found himself walking the streets of Cedar Falls, following the route that Margaret had taken during her insomniac wanderings. The town was quiet under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. His footsteps echoed off the empty buildings as he tried to imagine what had drawn Margaret from her warm apartment into the cold night air. Was it restlessness, anxiety, or was she keeping some kind of vigil, watching for something or someone that might arrive under cover of darkness? As he walked past the bookshop, Sheriff Garrett noticed something that made him stop and peer more closely at the building. In the apartment window above, a light was on. His pulse quickened as he hurried to the side door and climbed the stairs to Margaret's apartment. He had been there just 2 days earlier and was certain he had turned off all the lights before leaving. The door was still locked, and when he entered, he found the apartment exactly as he had left it, with one exception. In the living room, a small table lamp was glowing softly, casting warm light over Margaret's personal book collection. Sheriff Garrett was absolutely certain that this lamp had been off when he'd finished his search on Friday. He examined the lamp carefully, looking for any sign that it might have been on a timer or had turned itself on automatically. But it was a simple manual lamp with no special features. Someone had been in this apartment and had turned on this light. But who? And how had they gotten in without leaving any trace of forced entry? Sheriff Garrett spent the next hour going through the apartment again, looking for any other changes or signs of disturbance. Everything else appeared exactly as it had been 2 days earlier, down to the cold cup of tea still sitting on the kitchen counter. The light in Margaret's living room glowed peacefully, like a beacon calling someone home. But Margaret Whitmore was still missing, and now her disappearance had taken on an even more mysterious dimension. As Sheriff Garrett locked the apartment and returned to the empty street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by Margaret. He was growing increasingly certain that wherever she was, it wasn't by her own choice, but by someone else who was taking a very close interest in the investigation into her disappearance. The question was whether that someone meant to help find Margaret or to ensure that she stayed lost. Detective Ray Morrison arrived in Cedar Falls on Monday morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that marked him as a professional who had learned to work without fanfare. He was a lean man in his early 40s, with graying hair and the patient eyes of someone who had spent years listening to people's secrets and lies with equal attention. Sheriff Garrett met him at the diner for breakfast, spreading Margaret's case files across the red vinyl booth while they drank coffee and ate Helen Murphy's famous apple pancakes. Detective Morrison read through everything methodically, asking occasional questions, but mostly absorbing the information in silence. Interesting case, Detective Morrison said finally, closing the last folder. Woman with no verifiable past. Disappears without taking her purse, but her car is missing. Someone gains entry to her apartment and turns on a light but doesn't disturb anything else. And she's been receiving mysterious letters for 15 years. That's about the size of it, Sheriff Garrett confirmed. I've been in law enforcement here for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Well, let's start with what we can verify, Detective Morrison said, pulling out a notebook of his own. I want to examine the apartment again, then track down these lawyers in San Francisco. If we can figure out who Margaret Whitmore was before she came to Cedar Falls, we might have a better idea of why she disappeared. The two men spent the morning in Margaret's bookshop and apartment, with Detective Morrison applying his trained eye to details that Sheriff Garrett might have missed. He was particularly interested in Margaret's personal book collection, noting that many of the volumes were first editions or signed copies that would have been quite expensive. These books represent a significant investment, Detective Morrison observed, running his finger along the spine of a signed copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Not the kind of collection someone builds on a bookshop owner's salary. She either had money before she came here, or she's been receiving money from somewhere all along. In Margaret's bedroom, Detective Morrison discovered something that Sheriff Garrett had overlooked: a small safe hidden behind a false panel in the closet. The safe was locked, and they would need a warrant to have it opened, but its existence suggested that Margaret had been keeping something she considered valuable or sensitive. Asterisk. People don't install hidden safes for their grandmother's jewelry, Detective Morrison noted. Whatever's in there, she thought it was worth protecting. The most significant discovery came in Margaret's kitchen, where Detective Morrison noticed something odd about the positioning of the cold teacup on the counter. The cup was sitting in a small ring of moisture, but the ring was perfectly circular and uniform. Exactly what would result if someone had picked up the cup and then set it back down in precisely the same spot. Someone's been here since she disappeared, Detective Morrison concluded. Someone who wanted to make it look like nothing had been disturbed but couldn't resist examining that cup. The same someone who turned on the lamp upstairs? Sheriff Garrett asked, possibly. Or we're dealing with more than one person with an interest in Margaret's disappearance. That afternoon, Detective Morrison called the law office in San Francisco that had been sending Margaret monthly letters. The call yielded the first concrete information about Margaret's past, though it raised as many questions as it answered. The law firm of Hutchinson, Wells and Associates had been sending Margaret monthly payments of $2,500 for 15 years, as per the terms of a confidential settlement agreement. The lawyer who handled her case, James Hutchinson III, was initially reluctant to discuss the matter over the phone. I can tell you that Ms. Whitmore was the recipient of payments from a client settlement, Hutchinson said carefully. But the terms of the agreement include strict confidentiality provisions. I cannot discuss the nature of the original case without a court order. Detective Morrison explained that Margaret was missing and that any information about her past might be crucial to finding her. After consulting with his partners, Hutchinson agreed to provide basic facts about the settlement, though he remained bound by confidentiality regarding the details. Asterisk. The settlement was reached in 1972, Hutchinson revealed. It involved a personal injury case against a corporation. Miss Whitmore was a witness to an incident that occurred in 1971, and her testimony was instrumental in securing a favorable outcome for our client. As part of the settlement, she was granted anonymity and received regular payments in recognition of her cooperation and to help her establish a new life. What kind of incident? Detective Morrison pressed. I'm sorry, but I cannot provide those details. I can tell you that Ms. Whitmore's safety was a consideration in structuring the settlement. She was relocated and provided with documentation to establish her new identity. Documentation for a new identity? Detective Morrison felt a chill of understanding. Are you telling me that Margaret Whitmore isn't her real name? I cannot comment on that directly, but I think you can draw your own conclusions. The conversation ended with Hutchinson promising to review the settlement documents and see what additional information he could legally provide. But even without the details, Detective Morrison now understood why Margaret's past had been so carefully concealed. She had been a witness to something serious enough that a major corporation had agreed to pay her $2,500 a month for life in exchange for her silence and anonymity. She had been given a new identity and relocated to Cedar Falls, where she had built a quiet, careful life that kept her safely hidden from whatever or whoever she had originally been running from. But now she was missing, and Detective Morrison had to wonder if her carefully constructed anonymity had finally been compromised. The investigation took on new urgency as Detective Morrison and Sheriff Garrett began to consider the possibility that Margaret's disappearance was not voluntary. If someone had discovered her true identity, her testimony from 1971 might have made her a target for people with serious reasons to want her silenced. Tuesday brought another development that deepened the mystery further. The cream-colored letters that Margaret had been receiving from Portland were traced to a private mailbox service, but the person who rented the box had paid in cash and provided a false name and address. The Postal Service had no record of who had actually been sending the letters. However, the timing of these letters provided an intriguing clue. They had started arriving in 1985, 13 years after Margaret had arrived in Cedar Falls, and they came with clockwork regularity on the 15th of each month. Someone had been keeping track of Margaret's location and had been in contact with her for the past 2 years. Detective Morrison made a note to have the Portland Postal Service investigate the mailbox further, though he suspected that whoever had been sending the letters was too careful to have left an obvious trail. Wednesday morning brought the most disturbing development yet. Margaret's blue Honda Civic was found abandoned in a parking lot at Portland International Airport. The car had been there since Friday night, according to the parking attendant, placed in a long-term lot as if Margaret had been planning to take a trip. But when airport security checked their records, no passenger named Margaret Whitmore had boarded any flights on Friday or over the weekend. Either she had traveled under a different name, or the car had been left there by someone else as a false clue. Detective Morrison and Sheriff Garrett drove to Portland to examine the car personally. It was unlocked, with Margaret's keys still in the ignition, an unusual choice for someone planning to leave a car in long-term parking. The interior was immaculate, as they had expected from knowing Margaret's careful habits, but it also showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. In the glove compartment, they found something that made them both pause: a road map of Northern California with a route highlighted in yellow marker from Portland to San Francisco. The route passed through several small towns, with one stop circled in red pen, a tiny place called Millfield, about 60 miles north of San Francisco. She was planning a trip, Detective Morrison observed. But did she go willingly, or did someone else plan this route? The map raised new questions. If Margaret had decided to disappear voluntarily, why leave her purse behind but take the time to plan a driving route? And why abandon her car at the airport if she had been planning to drive to California? More puzzling still was the fact that the map showed wear patterns, suggesting it had been folded and unfolded many times over a long period. This wasn't a recently purchased map for a spontaneous trip. It was something Margaret had been studying and considering for months or even years. The investigation team returned to Cedar Falls that evening with more questions than answers. Margaret's disappearance was beginning to look less like a simple missing person case and more like a complex puzzle involving hidden identities, long-buried secrets, and someone who was very carefully covering their tracks. That night, Sheriff Garrett found himself once again walking the streets of Cedar Falls, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered. The town felt different now, knowing that Margaret had been living under an assumed identity, that her quiet life had been built on the foundation of some dangerous secret from her past. As he passed the bookshop, he noticed that the light in Margaret's apartment was on again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He called Detective Morrison, who was staying at the Cedar Falls Inn, and asked him to come immediately. Together, they approached the apartment building, moving as quietly as possible, in case whoever was inside was still there. The apartment door was locked, just as it had been before. But when they entered, they found changes that were subtle but unmistakable. Books had been moved slightly on the shelves. Papers had been shifted on Margaret's desk. Someone was methodically searching the apartment, looking for something specific. In the bedroom, they found that the hidden safe had been opened. It was empty now, its contents removed by whoever had been conducting this careful search. Professional job, Detective Morrison observed, examining the safe for signs of how it had been opened. No scratches, no damage. They either had the combination, or they're very good at what they do. But what were they looking for? Sheriff Garrett wondered aloud. Maybe they were looking for the same thing we are, Detective Morrison replied. Information about who Margaret really is and where she might have gone. As they prepared to leave, Detective Morrison noticed something else. On Margaret's bedside table, next to the book she had been reading, someone had left a single white rose. It was fresh, as if it had been placed there within the past few hours. And attached to the stem was a small card with 2 words written in elegant script. "I'm sorry." The rose was a message, but from whom? And what were they apologizing for? Margaret's disappearance was taking on the qualities of an elaborate and sorrowful dance, with players moving in patterns that only they understood, leaving behind traces of their presence like morning dew on grass. Asterisk. The white rose changed everything. Detective Morrison spent Thursday morning on the phone with florists throughout Oregon, trying to trace the source of the rose that had been left in Margaret's apartment. It was a premium variety, a white garden rose that retailed for significantly more than standard roses and was carried by only a few high-end floral shops in the region. The search yielded results more quickly than expected. Pemberton's Fine Flowers in Portland confirmed that they had sold a single white garden rose on Wednesday afternoon to a woman who paid in cash and declined to leave a name. The florist, Mrs. Pemberton, remembered the customer because of her unusual request. She asked specifically for a white garden rose, nothing else, Mrs. Pemberton told Detective Morrison over the phone. No arrangement, no wrapping, just the single rose. She was very particular about the variety, said. It had to be exactly that type. It struck me as odd because most people don't know the specific names of rose varieties. Can you describe the woman who bought it? Detective Morrison asked. Well-dressed, probably in her 50s or early 60s. Elegant bearing, expensive handbag. She had silver hair pulled back in a chignon, and she wore dark sunglasses even though it was cloudy. There was something about her that seemed refined, I suppose. Old money, if you know what I mean. Detective Morrison made careful notes. The description didn't match Margaret, but it suggested someone from her hidden past, someone with enough knowledge of her routines to know how to gain entry to her apartment, someone wealthy enough to buy expensive roses on impulse, someone who felt the need to apologize for something. The investigation took another turn when the court order for Margaret's settlement records arrived that afternoon. James Hutchinson III faxed over a redacted version of the documents, which revealed a story that was both more complex and more tragic than anyone had imagined. In 1971, Margaret had been working as a secretary at Blackwood Industries, a chemical manufacturing company in San Francisco. On March 5th of that year, she had been working late when she witnessed a meeting between company executives and representatives from the Fayoum, the Environmental Protection Agency. During that meeting, She overheard discussions about the deliberate concealment of data showing that one of Blackwood's chemical processes was contaminating groundwater in several communities. Margaret had also discovered documents in her boss's office detailing the cover-up, including bribes paid to local officials and strategies for discrediting scientists who had identified the contamination. When she attempted to report what she had learned to the authorities, she found herself facing intimidation and threats from unknown sources. The harassment escalated quickly. Margaret's apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. She received threatening phone calls at all hours. Her car tires were slashed repeatedly. Finally, someone tried to run her off the road while she was driving home from work, an incident that left her hospitalized with a concussion and convinced that her life was in genuine danger. With the help of environmental lawyers and FBI agents investigating Blackwood Industries, Margaret agreed to testify in exchange for protection and a new identity. Her testimony helped secure criminal convictions for several Blackwood executives and resulted in the largest environmental cleanup settlement in California history at that time. But the victory came at a tremendous personal cost. Margaret Whitmore had been born Rebecca Ann Thornfield, daughter of a working-class family in Sacramento. She had been engaged to marry her college sweetheart, David Chun, and had been planning a life that included graduate school, children, and a quiet career in education. Instead, she had been forced to sever all ties to her former life. Rebecca Thornfield had to die so that Margaret Whitmore could live safely in anonymity. The monthly payments from the settlement were intended to compensate her not just for her testimony, but for the loss of her identity, her relationships, and her dreams. She gave up everything, Detective Morrison explained to Sheriff Garrett. As they sat in the diner that evening, the case files spread between them once again. Her family, her fiancé, her entire future, all because she had the courage to stand up to corporate criminals. And now someone's found her, Sheriff Garrett sighed grimly. After 15 years of safety, someone's tracked down Margaret Whitmore. The question is whether they found Rebecca Thornfield or whether Rebecca found them. Asterisk Detective Morrison's comment proved to be more prescient than either man realized. Friday morning brought a phone call that would reshape their understanding of the case entirely. The caller was Dr. David Chun, not the same Dr. Chun who ran the medical clinic in Cedar Falls, but the man who had been Rebecca Thornfield's fiancé in 1971. He was now a successful physician in Portland, married with grown children, and he was calling because he had seen Margaret's missing person case mentioned in the Portland newspaper. I've been looking for Rebecca for 16 years, Dr. Chun told Detective Morrison. Not to cause trouble for her new life, just to know that she was safe. When I read about Margaret Whitmore disappearing from Cedar Falls, something about the description sounded familiar. I did some research, and I'm almost certain that Margaret Whitmore is Rebecca Thornfield. Dr. Chun's story filled in crucial gaps in their understanding of Margaret's situation. He had never accepted the official explanation that Rebecca had died in a car accident, partly because no body was ever found, and partly because he knew how frightened she had been in the weeks before her disappearance. She called me the night before she vanished, Dr. Chun recalled. She couldn't tell me much, but she said she was going to have to go away for a while. She said she would find a way to contact me when it was safe, but she never did. I always wondered if she was afraid that any contact might put me in danger too. But Dr. Chun had continued searching quietly over the years, using his medical connections and his own resources to track down leads. About 3 years ago, he had finally located Margaret in Cedar Falls. I didn't approach her directly, he explained. I wasn't sure she would want to see me, and I was afraid that my presence might compromise her safety. But I started writing to her letters that I sent through a private mail service. I never signed my name, but I tried to let her know that I had found her and that I still cared about her. Detective Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, the cream-colored letters she received every month. You've been writing to her for 2 years. Yes, and about 6 months ago she finally wrote back. Dr. Chun's voice grew soft, with memory as he described the correspondence that had developed between them. Margaret had been cautious at first, writing letters that were warm but careful, avoiding any details that might identify either of them if the letters were intercepted. But gradually, their communication had deepened into something like their old intimacy. Margaret had written about her life in Cedar Falls, her love for the bookshop, and the peace she had found in the mountains. Dr. Chun had shared news of his family, his medical practice, and the ways that losing her had shaped his life. She was thinking about meeting me, Dr. Chun revealed. In her last letter, she said she had been considering it for months. She mentioned that she might take a trip to California soon, that there were things from her old life that she needed to confront. When did you receive this letter? Detective Morrison asked. 2 weeks ago. I wrote back immediately, suggesting that we meet somewhere neutral, somewhere she would feel safe, but I never got a response. Dr. Chun's account suggested that Margaret might have planned her own disappearance, not because she was running from danger, but because she was finally ready to reclaim some part of her old identity. The map found in her car, with its route to Northern California, might have represented not a flight from her life in Cedar Falls, but a journey toward the connection she had been forced to abandon. But if that was the case, where was she now? And who had been searching her apartment? The investigation had revealed the outlines of Margaret's story, but the current mystery remained as elusive as ever. Somewhere in the web of past and present, hidden identity and revealed truth, Margaret Whitmore was either hiding or being hidden. The white rose left in her bedroom suggested sorrow and apology. Someone who cared about her was sorry for something. But whether they were sorry for taking her away from Cedar Falls, or sorry for bringing her past back into her present, Detective Morrison couldn't yet determine. As the week drew to a close, he found himself with a clear picture of who Margaret Whitmore had been, but no clearer understanding of where she was now. The investigation had peeled back layers of carefully constructed anonymity to reveal Rebecca Thornfield's sacrifice and Margaret Whitmore's quiet courage, but it had also revealed that Margaret's disappearance was far more complex than a simple missing person case. It was a story about the weight of memory, the price of truth, and the lengths that people will go to protect or reclaim the connections that make life meaningful. The question that remained was whether Margaret's story would end with reunion and healing, or whether the forces that had shaped her life would ultimately consume it. Asterisk, the weekend brought an unexpected visitor to Cedar Falls, a visitor who would provide the key to understanding not just Margaret's disappearance, but the intricate web of relationships that had been hidden beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. Sister Mary Catherine arrived on Saturday morning, driving a modest sedan with California plates and carrying herself with the kind of serene dignity that spoke of decades spent in service to others. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair tucked beneath a simple veil and eyes that held the deep compassion of someone who had spent her life counseling the troubled and protecting the vulnerable. She went directly to Sheriff Garrett's office, where she introduced herself as the person who had been helping Margaret Rebecca navigate the complexities of her hidden identity for the past 15 years. I was the liaison between Rebecca and the FBI during her relocation, Sister Mary Catherine explained, settling into the chair across from Sheriff Garrett's desk with the careful movements of someone who had learned to find peace in any circumstances. My order has a long history of helping people who need to disappear for their own safety. We helped establish her new identity as Margaret Whitmore and supported her through the transition. Sheriff Garrett called Detective Morrison, who arrived within minutes, eager to hear what Sister Mary Catherine could tell them about Margaret's situation. We never lost contact completely, Sister Mary Catherine continued. I visited her twice. A year, always quietly, and we corresponded regularly. She was one of the most courageous people I've ever known, Someone who sacrificed everything to do what was right, then built a beautiful new life from nothing. But something changed recently. Detective Morrison observed. Dr. Chun told us that Margaret had been considering reconnecting with her past. Sister Mary Catherine nodded sadly. Rebecca had been struggling with that decision for years. The isolation was taking a toll on her, especially as she approached her 50th birthday. She began to feel that she had paid enough for her courage. That perhaps it was time to reclaim some of what she had given up. Did she tell you she was planning to disappear? Sheriff Garrett asked. Not disappear exactly, Sister Mary Catherine replied carefully. But she had been talking about taking a leave of absence from the bookshop, about traveling to California to visit some of the places from her old life. She wanted to see if it was possible to be Rebecca Thornfield again, even part-time. Sister. Mary Catherine reached into her handbag and withdrew a letter written in Margaret's careful script. She sent me this 3 weeks ago. I think you should read it. The letter was dated September 25th, 1987, and it revealed Margaret's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance. Asterisk, Dear Sister Mary Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well and at peace. I have been doing a great deal of thinking lately about the life I left behind and the life I've built here in Cedar Falls. For 15 years, I have been grateful for the safety and anonymity you helped provide, and I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful for the sacrifices so many people made on my behalf, but I find myself wondering lately if I've been too cautious, too afraid to live fully because of things that happened so long ago. The people who threatened me are mostly dead, or in prison now. The company I testified against no longer exists. Perhaps it's time to consider whether Rebecca Thornfield can emerge from the shadows without endangering Margaret Whitmore. I've been corresponding with someone from my past, someone who knew Rebecca and loved her. Through these letters, I've begun to remember who I was before fear shaped all my choices. I think I would like to see if that person still exists inside me. I'm planning to take some time away from the shop next month to explore these possibilities. I may travel to California, visit some of the places where Rebecca lived and worked. If you don't hear from me for a while, please don't worry. I need to do this carefully and quietly, but I'm no longer content to live my entire life looking over my shoulder. Please pray for me as I try to find a way to honor both the woman I was and the woman I became. With love and gratitude, Margaret Rebecca Asterisk. The letter painted a picture of someone who had been planning a careful reconnection with her past, not a panicked flight from her present. But it also revealed how isolated Margaret had felt, despite the warm community she had built around herself in Cedar Falls. Asterisk, she was lonely, Sister Mary Catherine observed softly. Deeply, profoundly lonely in ways that even the kindest neighbors couldn't address. She had built a wonderful life, but it was built on a foundation of secrets. She could never fully connect with anyone because she could never fully be herself. Detective Morrison studied the letter carefully, but this suggests she was planning to leave voluntarily. Her car was found at Portland Airport with a map showing a route to California. Maybe she did exactly what she said she was going to do. Then why leave her purse behind? Sheriff Garrett asked. And who's been searching her apartment? Sister Mary Catherine looked troubled. There's something else you need to know. Rebecca wasn't the only witness who testified against Blackwood Industries. There were 3 of us who provided crucial testimony, and we were all relocated with new identities. She paused, clearly reluctant to share what came next. 6 months ago, one of the other witnesses, a man who had been living in Arizona under the name Thomas Mitchell, was found dead in his home. The local police ruled it heart attack, but there were some unusual circumstances. His house had been searched, though nothing appeared to be missing. Detective Morrison felt a chill of understanding. Someone's been tracking down the Blackwood witnesses. It's possible, Sister Mary Catherine admitted, which is why I'm so concerned about Rebecca's disappearance. If someone has been systematically Locating people from the original case, she could be in serious danger. The investigation suddenly took on new urgency. What had seemed like a personal journey toward reconnection with her past might actually be a carefully orchestrated elimination of witnesses who still posed a threat to someone asterisk, but who would still care about the Blackwood case after 16 years. The company had been dissolved, its executives had served their prison sentences, and the environmental cleanup had been completed. What secrets could still be worth killing for? Sister Mary Catherine provided a possible answer. There were rumors at the time that Blackwood had been working on something beyond the environmental contamination, some kind of research project that involved classified government contracts. Rebecca mentioned seeing documents that she didn't understand, papers with security clearances and references to weapons systems. Chemical weapons? Detective Morrison asked. Possibly. Or industrial processes that could be converted to weapons. Production. The FBI was never able to pursue that angle fully because the relevant documents disappeared before they could be subpoenaed. The pieces were falling into place in a pattern that was both clearer and more frightening than what they had previously imagined. Margaret's disappearance might not be about her personal desire to reconnect with her past, but about someone else's determination to eliminate witnesses to secrets that went far deeper than environmental crimes. As the afternoon wore on, Detective Morrison and Sheriff Garrett worked with Sister Mary Catherine to develop a timeline of events and identify potential threats. The picture that emerged was of a methodical campaign to track down and silence the remaining Blackwood witnesses. Thomas Mitchell had died 6 months ago. Rebecca Thornfield had disappeared 1 week ago. That left one remaining witness, a woman who had been living in Seattle under the name Linda Patterson. Detective Morrison immediately placed a call to the Seattle Police Department, asking them to perform a welfare check on Linda Patterson. The news that came back an hour later confirmed their worst fears. Linda Patterson had been reported missing by her employer 3 days ago, after failing to show up for work at the library where she had been employed for 12 years. 3 witnesses, 3 disappearances spread across 6 months, but following the same pattern: quiet, careful people who had built new lives in anonymity, suddenly vanishing without explanation. Someone's been very patient and very thorough, Detective Morrison observed grimly. They've been planning this for months, maybe years. But who had the resources and motivation to track down witnesses from a 16-year-old case? And more importantly, were Margaret and Linda Patterson still alive, or had the investigation arrived too late to save them? As evening settled over Cedar Falls, the case had transformed from a local missing person investigation into something much larger and more dangerous. Margaret Whitmer's disappearance was connected to a web of secrets and violence that stretched back to the early 1970s and might still be claiming victims. The question now was whether the investigation could unravel that web before it claimed any more lives, and whether Margaret was somewhere out there waiting for rescue, or whether she had already become another casualty in a war most people had forgotten was still being fought. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not through dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small details that gradually illuminated a larger picture, like dawn slowly spreading across the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls, revealing a landscape that had been there all along but hidden by darkness. Sunday morning brought Detective Morrison and Sheriff Garrett back to Portland, where they had arranged to meet with Dr. David Chun at his office. They hoped that Margaret's former fiancé might have additional information about her plans or her state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance. Dr. Chun's medical office was located in a professional building overlooking the Willamette River, and the man himself was exactly what Detective Morrison had expected: intelligent, thoughtful, and carrying the kind of quiet sadness that spoke of old losses never fully healed. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Dr. Chun said as he led them into his private office. There are some things about Rebecca's letters that I didn't mention, details that seemed unimportant at the time, but might be relevant now. He retrieved a small wooden box from his desk drawer, handling it with the care usually reserved for precious artifacts. Inside were Margaret's letters, written on cream-colored stationery in her careful handwriting. In her most recent letters, she mentioned feeling like she was being watched. Dr. Chun revealed, selecting one of the letters and reading from it. I know this probably sounds paranoid, but I've had the strangest feeling lately that someone has been taking an interest in my routines. Nothing I can point to specifically, just a sense that my privacy has been compromised somehow. Detective Morrison felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a crucial piece of evidence. When did she write this? About 3 weeks ago. And there's more. Dr. Chun selected another letter. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding a meeting, and I've decided that I would like to see you again. But I think we should be very careful about how we arrange it. I have a feeling that my quiet life in Cedar Falls may not be as private as I thought. She knew she was in danger. Sheriff Garrett observed. It seems that way. But she was also determined not to let fear control her life anymore. Dr. Chun's voice carried a mixture of pride and regret. She wrote about feeling like she had been living as a ghost for 15 years, afraid to form real connections or pursue real happiness. She said she was tired of being afraid. Dr. Chun shared one final piece of information that would prove crucial to understanding what had happened to Margaret. In her last letter, she had suggested a specific meeting place, a small inn called the Riverside Lodge in the town of Millfield, California, the same town that had been circled on the map found in her car. She said she had looked into it and found that it was the kind of place where people could meet quietly without attracting attention, Dr. Chun explained. She suggested that we meet there on the weekend of October 24th, next weekend. Detective Morrison and Sheriff Garrett exchanged glances. Margaret had been planning to travel to California, but not to disappear. She had been planning to meet the man she had loved and lost 16 years ago, to see if there was still a possibility of reclaiming some portion of the happiness that had been stolen from her. The investigation team returned to Cedar Falls that evening with a clearer picture of Margaret's intentions, but an even deeper concern for her safety. If she had been planning a secret meeting with Dr. Chun, whoever had been tracking the Blackwood witnesses might have intercepted her communications and used the planned meeting as an opportunity to eliminate her. Monday morning brought the breakthrough they had been hoping for, though it came from an unexpected source. Jenny Martinez from the post office called to report that she had remembered something important about the cream-colored letters Margaret had been receiving. I was thinking about those letters, Jenny explained, and I remembered that about a month ago. One of them came back marked "Return to Sender Forwarding Address Expired," but instead of going back to the Portland Mail Service, it came back here to the Cedar Falls post office. Jenny had kept the returned letter, thinking that she might be able to help Margaret resolve whatever postal problem had caused it to be returned. The envelope provided the first concrete clue about who had been monitoring Margaret's correspondence. Forwarding address label on the envelope was barely visible, but Detective Morrison was able to make out the key information. The letter had been forwarded to a post office box in San Francisco, registered to someone named Catherine Blackwood, the same name as the chemical company that had been at the center of the original case. Detective Morrison spent Monday afternoon researching the Blackwood family and discovered that Catherine Blackwood was the daughter of the company's founder, William Blackwood. She had inherited the family fortune when the company was dissolved and had spent the years since then involved in various business ventures and philanthropic activities. But there was another side to Catherine Blackwood that emerged from deeper investigation. She had never accepted that her father's company had been legitimately prosecuted, instead believing that the environmental charges were part of a conspiracy to steal the family's wealth and reputation. She had spent years pursuing legal challenges to the original settlements, and had apparently never stopped believing that the witnesses who testified against Blackwood Industries were criminals who had perjured themselves for money. More disturbingly, Catherine Blackwood had the resources to fund the kind of systematic campaign to track down and eliminate witnesses that the investigation had uncovered. She was wealthy, well-connected, and had access to private investigators and security firms that could operate with minimal oversight. The pattern became clear. Catherine Blackwood had spent years locating the witnesses who had testified against her father's company, and she was now systematically eliminating them. Thomas Mitchell in Arizona, Linda Patterson in Seattle, and now Margaret Whitmore in Cedar Falls. Detective Morrison obtained a warrant to search the post office box in San Francisco, but found that it had been closed and emptied 3 weeks earlier. Right around the time that Margaret had begun to suspect she was being watched, the investigation had identified the likely perpetrator, but it had also revealed how carefully and professionally the operation was being conducted. Catherine Blackwood was not acting impulsively or carelessly. She was implementing a long-term plan with the patience and resources necessary to avoid detection. Tuesday brought the news that everyone had been dreading. Linda Patterson's body was found in a remote area outside Seattle, apparently the victim of a hiking accident. But the Seattle police noted several suspicious circumstances. Linda had been an experienced hiker, the weather had been clear, and her death appeared to result from a fall that the terrain wouldn't normally cause. 3 witnesses, 2 confirmed dead, 1 still missing. The focus of the investigation shifted from finding Margaret to finding Catherine Blackwood before she could complete her systematic elimination of the people who had destroyed her father's company. But Catherine Blackwood had vanished as completely as Margaret, leaving behind only closed post office boxes and canceled business arrangements. Detective Morrison found himself facing a race against time. If Margaret was still alive, she was in the hands of someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to kill and who had the resources to operate without leaving obvious traces. Every day that passed reduced the likelihood that they would find her before it was too late. But there was one potential lead that offered hope. The Riverside Lodge in Millfield, California, where Margaret had planned to meet Dr. Chun, might still be relevant to Catherine Blackwood's plans. If she had intercepted Margaret's correspondence, she would know about the planned meeting and might try to use it to her advantage. Detective Morrison contacted the Millfield police and asked them to place the Riverside Lodge under surveillance. If Catherine Blackwood was planning to use the location for some final confrontation with Margaret, they might have one last chance to intervene. Wednesday evening brought a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Margaret herself, speaking in a voice that was carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone of fear that was impossible to miss. Detective Morrison, this is Margaret Whitmore. I understand you've been looking for me. Margaret, where are you? Are you safe? For now, but I need you to listen carefully because I don't have much time. I'm being held by someone who wants information about my testimony in the Blackwood case, information I don't have. She thinks I kept copies of documents that were destroyed years ago. Where are you, Margaret? I'm not sure exactly. Somewhere in Northern California, I think. A house in the woods, very isolated. But Detective Morrison, you need to know she's planning something for this weekend. She's going to use me to try to trap Dr. Chun when he comes to Millfield for our planned meeting. The line went quiet for a moment, then Margaret's voice returned, urgent and frightened. She's coming back. Remember Millfield this weekend. Don't let her. The line went dead. Detective Morrison immediately called the Millfield police and arranged for them to increase their surveillance of the Riverside Lodge. But he also knew that Margaret was running out of time. Catherine Blackwood had kept her alive because she wanted something. But once she realized that Margaret couldn't provide what she was looking for, there would be no reason to keep her alive any longer. The investigation had finally identified both the perpetrator and the general location where Margaret was being held. But it had also revealed that Catherine Blackwood was planning one final confrontation, a trap designed to eliminate both Margaret and Dr. Chun in a carefully orchestrated resolution to her 16-year quest for revenge. The race against time had begun in earnest, and Detective Morrison found himself hoping that the investigation had uncovered Catherine Blackwood's plans before it was too late to save not just Margaret, but everyone else who had become entangled in this web of long-delayed vengeance. Asterisk. The Riverside Lodge sat nestled in a grove of redwood trees, beside a stream that sang softly as it made its way toward the Pacific Ocean. It was exactly the kind of place that Margaret had described in her letters: quiet, private, and sufficiently isolated that people could meet without attracting unwanted attention. Detective Morrison arrived in Millfield on Thursday evening, accompanied by Sheriff Garrett and a small team of state police officers who had been briefed on the situation. The local police had been maintaining surveillance of the lodge since Wednesday, but so far they had seen no sign of either Catherine Blackwood or Margaret. The lodge itself was a collection of rustic cabins surrounding a main building that housed the registration desk, dining room, and common areas. It was the kind of establishment that attracted couples seeking romantic getaways and families wanting to disconnect from the pressures of modern life. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfect place for two people to reunite after years of separation. But these were far from normal circumstances. Dr. David Chun had arrived that afternoon, despite Detective Morrison's strong recommendation that he stay away. The doctor had listened to the warnings about Catherine Blackwood and the danger she represented, but he had ultimately decided that he couldn't abandon Margaret when she needed him most. "I lost her once because I was powerless to protect her," Dr. Chun had explained. "I won't let that happen again." Detective Morrison had to admit that Dr. Chun's presence might be necessary to draw Catherine Blackwood into the open. If she was planning to use Margaret as bait to trap the doctor, then the trap wouldn't be sprung unless he was actually there. But the risk was enormous. They were gambling not just with Dr. Chun's life, but with Margaret's as well. Friday passed without incident, building tension among the surveillance team like pressure building behind a dam. Catherine Blackwood was somewhere in the area. Margaret's phone call had confirmed that, but she was too experienced and too careful to reveal herself prematurely. Detective Morrison spent the day reviewing everything they knew about Catherine Blackwood and trying to anticipate how she might approach the lodge. She had resources, professional help, and 16 years of planning behind her. She would not be easily cornered or surprised, but she also had something that might prove to be a weakness, an obsessive need to confront the people she blamed for destroying her father's legacy. She wasn't simply trying to eliminate witnesses. She was trying to extract some kind of justice or revenge that would satisfy her deep sense of grievance. Saturday morning brought the first sign that Catherine Blackwood was ready to make her move. The lodge's front desk received a phone call from someone claiming to be Margaret Whitmore, asking to reserve a cabin for that evening. She said she was planning to meet someone there, the desk clerk reported to Detective Morrison. "Wanted to know if we had any cabins that were particularly private, away from the main lodge." The clerk had assigned Margaret to cabin 7, which sat at the far end of the lodge property, separated from the other buildings by about 100 yards of forest. It was perfect for what Catherine Blackwood had in mind, isolated enough that she could control the situation without interference, but close enough to the main lodge that Dr. Chun could easily find it. Detective Morrison positioned his surveillance team in the woods surrounding cabin 7, with clear sight lines to all approaches but far enough away that they wouldn't be detected by someone with professional security training. The plan was to wait until Catherine Blackwood arrived with Margaret, then move in to make arrests while minimizing risk to the hostage. But as afternoon faded into evening, Detective Morrison began to realize that Catherine Blackwood was more sophisticated than they had anticipated. She would not simply arrive at Cabin 7 with Margaret and hope for the best. She had been planning this confrontation for too long to leave anything to chance. The truth became apparent when Dr. Chun received a phone call at his room in the main lodge at exactly 6 o'clock. "David?" The voice was Margaret's, but there was something wrong with it, a flatness that suggested she was reading from a script or speaking under duress. "Margaret, where are you? Are you all right?" "I'm fine, but there's been a change of plans. I need you to come to Cabin 12 instead. OF Cabin 7. And David, you need to come alone. No police, no one else. Just you." "Margaret, I don't think..." "Please, David, trust me. Cabin 12 in 20 minutes. And make sure no one follows you." The line went dead, leaving Dr. Chun staring at the phone with a mixture of hope and dread. Detective Morrison, who had been monitoring the call, immediately realized what was happening. Catherine Blackwood had been watching the lodge, had probably identified the surveillance team, and was now changing the parameters of her plan. Cabin 12 was on the opposite side of the lodge from Cabin 7, in an area that the surveillance team had not specifically prepared to cover. "She's playing chess while we're playing checkers," Detective Morrison muttered as he rapidly repositioned his team to cover the new location. Cabin 12 sat at the edge of a small meadow, with forest on 3 sides and the stream running behind it. It was even more isolated than Cabin 7, and the approach routes were more limited, making it both easier to watch and harder to assault if something went wrong. Dr. Chun, against all advice but true to his word, walked alone through the gathering. Darkness toward Cabin 12. Detective Morrison's team moved through the forest like shadows, taking positions where they could observe the cabin without being seen. The cabin appeared empty and dark as Dr. Chun approached. He knocked on the door and called Margaret's name, but received no answer. After a moment's hesitation, he tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner. Margaret sat in a chair near the window, her hands bound but otherwise appearing unharmed. Standing behind her, mostly hidden in the shadows, was a woman who could only be Catherine Blackwood. "Come in, Dr. Chun," Catherine said, her voice cultured and calm. "Close the door behind you and have a seat on the couch. We have some things to discuss." Dr. Chun entered slowly, his eyes fixed on Margaret. She looked tired and frightened, but she was alive and apparently uninjured. That was what mattered most to him in that moment. "Let her go," Dr. Chun said quietly. "Whatever this is about, it's between you and me now." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Catherine replied, stepping into the light so that Dr. Chun could see her clearly for the first time. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and expensive clothes, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of years of obsession and carefully nursed grievance. This was someone who had allowed anger to consume her life, who had spent 16 years planning this moment. "This is about justice," Catherine continued. "Justice for my father, justice for my family, and justice for the company that was destroyed by lies and perjury." "Your father's company was poisoning people," Dr. Chen said firmly. "The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was fabricated." Catherine's composure cracked slightly, revealing the rage that had been driving her for so many years. "My father was a good man who built an honest business. But people like her," she gestured toward Margaret, "people like her destroyed him with their lies." Margaret spoke for the first time since Dr. Chun had entered the cabin. "I told thee." "Truth, Catherine. I only told the truth about what I saw and heard." "You told them what they wanted to hear," Catherine snapped. "You sold your testimony for money and a new identity. You're nothing but a paid liar." Detective Morrison, listening through surveillance equipment, recognized the signs of someone who had constructed an elaborate, alternative reality to avoid dealing with uncomfortable truths. Catherine Blackwood had spent 16 years convincing herself that her father had been innocent, that the witnesses had been bought, that the entire prosecution had been a conspiracy. I've spent years tracking down the people who destroyed my family, Catherine continued. Thomas Mitchell thought he was safe in Arizona. Linda Patterson thought Seattle was far enough away. They were both wrong. The confession to 2 murders delivered so matter-of-factly sent a chill through everyone listening. Catherine Blackwood had crossed a line that there was no coming back from, and her calm recitation of her crimes suggested that she felt completely justified in what she had done. But you two are special, she continued, looking back and forth between Margaret and Dr. Chun. You represent the ultimate corruption of justice, a witness who sold her testimony, and a man who helped her escape. The consequences of her perjury. I never helped Rebecca escape, Dr. Chun protested. I didn't even know what had happened to her until years later. But you've been in contact with her, Catherine said. Your letters to her have been quite romantic. Star-crossed lovers reunited. After years of separation. It's almost like a fairy tale. The surveillance team outside the cabin heard the conversation becoming more heated and prepared to move in. But Detective Morrison held them back, knowing that any sudden action might result in Margaret's death. As long as Catherine Blackwood was talking, she wasn't shooting, and there was always a chance that her obsession with justifying her actions might lead her to make a mistake. What do you want? Dr. Chun asked. You've got us here. What happens now? Catherine smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Now you're going to help me correct the historical record. You're going to sign statements admitting that Rebecca's testimony was perjured, that she was paid to lie about my father's company. And then you're going to disappear, just like Thomas and Linda did. And if we refuse, Margaret asked quietly, then you'll die anyway, but without the opportunity to set the record straight. Your choice. Catherine produced a pistol from her handbag, a small, elegant weapon that looked like it had been designed more for intimidation than actual use. But Detective Morrison knew that even small pistols could be lethal at close range, and Catherine Blackwood had already demonstrated her willingness to kill. You have 5 minutes to decide, Catherine announced, checking her watch. Sign the statements, and your deaths will be quick and clean. Refuse, and things will be much more unpleasant. It was the ultimatum that Detective Morrison had been waiting for. Catherine Blackwood had revealed her entire plan and had given them a specific timeline to work with. More importantly, she had positioned herself in a way that gave the surveillance team a clear shot through the cabin window. But as Detective Morrison prepared to give the order to move in, Margaret did something that changed everything. I'll sign your statement, she said quietly. But only if you let David go first. He never did anything wrong. He doesn't deserve to die for my choices. Margaret, no, Dr. Chun started to protest. It's all right, David, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I've been running from this for 16 years. Maybe it's time to stop running. Catherine Blackwood studied Margaret with the kind of cold appraisal that a scientist might give to an interesting specimen. You're trying to manipulate me. No, Margaret replied. I'm trying to save the man I love. Isn't that something you can understand? Isn't that what you're doing for your father? For the first time since the conversation had begun, Catherine Blackwood seemed uncertain. The parallel that Margaret had drawn between her own love for Dr. Chen and Catherine's devotion to her father's memory was clearly having an effect. It's not the same thing, Catherine said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Isn't it? Margaret pressed. We're both trying to protect the people who matter most to us. The difference is that David is innocent, and your father wasn't. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Detective Morrison realized that Margaret was deliberately provoking Catherine Blackwood, trying to force her into making a mistake that would give the surveillance team an opportunity to act. Catherine's face flushed with anger, and she raised the pistol toward Margaret. Don't you dare! The shot came not from Catherine's weapon, but from the police sniper positioned in the trees outside the cabin. The bullet passed through the window and struck Catherine in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending the pistol flying across the room. In the chaos that followed, Detective Morrison and his team burst through the door, quickly securing the scene and providing medical attention to Catherine Blackwood while other officers freed Margaret and Dr. Chun from their restraints. The confrontation that had been 16 years in the making was over in a matter of seconds, ended not by dramatic heroics or elaborate schemes, but by careful police work and Margaret's courage in the face of mortal danger. As the ambulance carried Catherine Blackwood away to face charges for multiple murders, Detective Morrison found Margaret and Dr. Chun sitting together on the cabin's small porch, holding hands and watching the stars appear in the clear mountain sky. "How did you know she would react that way?" Detective Morrison asked Margaret. "I didn't," Margaret admitted. "But I knew she was consumed by her need to justify what she'd done. People like that can't resist defending their actions, even when it puts them at risk." Dr. Chun squeezed her hand gently. "You saved my life." "You saved mine 16 years ago," Margaret replied, "by loving me enough to let me go when I had to disappear. Now maybe we can find out what it's like to love each other without having to hide." The weeks that followed the confrontation at the Riverside Lodge passed with the kind of quiet healing that mountain towns like Cedar Falls understood better than most places. There were legal proceedings to attend, statements to give, and the complex process of untangling 16 years of carefully constructed anonymity. But through it all, Margaret found herself surrounded by a community that had never really needed to know her secrets to accept her as one of their own. The bookshop remained closed for 2 weeks while Margaret recovered from her ordeal and dealt with the immediate aftermath of Catherine Blackwood's arrest. But the people of Cedar Falls took care of their own in the way that small communities always have. Betty Morrison organized a rotation of neighbors to bring meals and check on Margaret's well-being. Tom and Helen Murphy maintained the building and watered the plants. Sheriff Garrett made sure that no reporters or curiosity seekers disturbed her privacy while she healed. Dr. David Chun remained in Cedar Falls during this period, staying at the Cedar Falls Inn but spending most of his time at Margaret's apartment, helping her process not just the trauma of her kidnapping, but the larger questions about who she wanted to be now that the threats from her past had finally been resolved. "I keep waiting for the fear to come back," Margaret confided to him one evening as they sat in her living room, surrounded by the books that had been her companions for so many years. "For 15 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my safety was fragile, that it could all be taken away if the wrong person discovered who I really was. Now that the danger is over, I don't quite know how to feel secure." "Maybe security isn't something you feel," David suggested gently. "Maybe it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice. You've been building it here in Cedar Falls for 15 years. The danger is gone, but the foundation you created is still here." They had spent long hours talking about the future, about the possibility of David relocating his medical practice to Cedar Falls, about whether Margaret wanted to continue being Margaret Whitmore or reclaim her identity as Rebecca Thornfield. There were no easy answers to these questions, but for the first time in 16 years, they had the luxury of time to explore them. Sister Mary Catherine visited during Margaret's second week of recovery, bringing with her the kind of peaceful presence that had helped sustain Margaret through the darkest periods of her exile. They talked about forgiveness of Catherine Blackwood, of the circumstances that had shaped both their lives, and most importantly, of the choices Margaret had made in response to those circumstances. "You've carried guilt for 16 years about the life you had to leave behind," Sister Mary Catherine observed as they sat in Margaret's kitchen, sharing the chamomile tea that had become such an important ritual. "But you need to understand that you didn't abandon Rebecca Thornfield, you transformed her. Everything good about Rebecca lives on in Margaret, and everything you've built here in Cedar Falls was built with Rebecca's courage and integrity. Sometimes I feel like I've been two different people," Margaret replied. and I'm not sure how to integrate them into one. You don't have to choose between them, Sister Mary Catherine said softly. You can be both. Rebecca Thornfield was a young woman who had the courage to stand up for what was right. Margaret Whitmore is a mature woman who built a meaningful life from the ashes of that courage. They're not separate people. They're chapters in the same beautiful story. The conversation helped Margaret understand something that had been troubling her ever since Catherine Blackwood's arrest. She had been thinking that she needed to decide whether to remain Margaret or become Rebecca again. But the truth was more complex and more hopeful than that simple choice. She could be both. She could honor the sacrifice that Rebecca had made, while embracing the life that Margaret had created. The name on her driver's license might change, but the essence of who she had become would remain the same. 3 weeks after the events at the Riverside Lodge, Margaret reopened her bookshop. Word of her ordeal had spread throughout the valley, and she had been concerned that people might treat her differently, might see her as a victim or a curiosity rather than simply as the woman who had been serving their literary needs for 15 years. But when she turned the sign from closed to open on that first morning back, the response from the community was exactly what she should have expected from Cedar Falls. Mrs. Patterson arrived at 9:15 with a casserole and a new mystery novel she thought Margaret might enjoy. Tom Murphy stopped by to make sure the heating system had been working properly while the shop was closed. Father O'Connor came by to welcome her back and to let her know that she would always have a place in the community's prayers. Most importantly, Betty Morrison returned to work as if nothing had changed, picking up her duties and chatting about ordinary things, the weather, upcoming holiday preparations, and a particularly good apple cake recipe that Margaret still wanted to try. "I'm glad you're back," Betty said simply as they worked together to restock the shelves and update the inventory. "The shop wasn't the same without you." It was exactly what Margaret needed to hear. Not dramatic declarations of support or intrusive questions about her experience, just the simple acknowledgement that she had been missed and that her return was welcome. David had arranged to transfer his medical practice to a clinic in the county seat, about 30 miles from Cedar Falls, where he could serve a broader community while still maintaining a home base in the town that had become their sanctuary. It was a compromise that would allow them to build a life together while respecting the connections Margaret had formed over 15 years. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked him as they walked through the town one evening, following the route that had once been her solitary path during sleepless nights, but was now a shared exploration of their new life together. "I've been sure since 1971, David replied. "I've just been waiting for the rest of our story to catch up with what my heart always knew." They had decided that Margaret would legally reclaim her birth name. She would become Rebecca Thornfield once again, but that she would continue to operate the bookshop as Margaret Whitmore. It was a way of honoring both versions of herself while acknowledging the community that had sustained her through the most difficult years of her life. The legal proceedings against Catherine Blackwood moved forward with the inexorable pace of justice. She had been charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Thomas Mitchell and Linda Patterson, 1 count of kidnapping in Margaret's case, and numerous other charges related to her systematic campaign against the Blackwood witnesses. Her lawyer attempted to mount an insanity defense, arguing that years of obsession with her father's legacy had driven her beyond rational thought. But the evidence of careful planning and methodical execution made it clear that Catherine had known exactly what she was doing and had chosen to do it anyway. Asterisk. She was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing to a close a chapter that had begun with corporate corruption in 1971 and ended with personal vengeance in 1987. 3 people had died because one woman could not accept that her father had been a criminal. But the 4th intended victim had survived to tell the story. Detective Morrison visited Cedar Falls one final time in December, partly to check on Margaret's continuing recovery, and partly to satisfy his own curiosity about how the case had ultimately resolved itself. He found Margaret and David working together in the bookshop, preparing for the holiday season with displays of cozy mysteries and gift books that would appeal to people looking for presents that would provide comfort during the long winter months. "You look happy," Detective Morrison observed as Margaret showed him around the shop, pointing out changes and improvements that had been made since her return. "I am," Margaret replied, and there was a quality to her voice that hadn't been there during the investigation, a settledness, a sense of being fully present in her own life. "For the first time in 16 years, I'm not looking over my shoulder or waiting for something bad to happen. I can just be. And you're staying in Cedar Falls?" "This is home," Margaret said simply. "It has been for 15 years, but now I can choose to stay instead of feeling like I have to hide here. That makes all the difference." Detective Morrison spent an hour in the shop, browsing the mystery section and accepting Margaret's recommendations for his winter reading. As he prepared to leave, he asked the question that had been troubling him since the case was closed. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Catherine Blackwood had succeeded? If we hadn't found you in time?" Margaret considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes. But what I think about more is how many people cared enough to look for me when I disappeared. I spent so many years feeling isolated and alone, but when I was in real danger, an entire community mobilized to find me. Sheriff Garrett, you, Sister Mary Catherine, Dr. Chun, even Betty Morrison, and the Murphys. I wasn't as alone as I thought." "I was, and now?" Detective Morrison asked. Margaret smiled, an expression of pure contentment that transformed her face. "Now I'm not alone at all." As Detective Morrison drove away from Cedar Falls that evening, he reflected on the case that had consumed weeks of his life and changed the lives of so many people. It had been a story about the long reach of the past, about the price of courage, and about the lengths that people will go to protect or destroy the things they care about most. But ultimately, it had been a story about community, about the way that people can create families and homes in the most unlikely places, about the power of acceptance and support to sustain people through their darkest moments. Margaret Whitmore Rebecca Thornfield had survived 16 years of exile and a brush with death, not because she was particularly strong or brave, though she was both of those things, but because she had chosen to trust in the possibility of connection, even when trust felt dangerous. The bookshop in Cedar Falls continued to glow with warm light through the winter evenings, serving as a gathering place for people who understood that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we live together, day by ordinary day, in communities that choose to care for their own. The autumn of 1997 found Cedar Falls, much as it had always been, a pocket of tranquility in the mountains where time moved at its own pace and people were allowed to become their truest selves without interference or judgment. The lumber mill still marked the days with its steady rhythm. Main Street still stretched for exactly 12 blocks, and the bookshop still glowed with warm yellow light in the gathering darkness. But there were changes too, the kind of gentle evolution that healthy communities experience as they grow and adapt while maintaining their essential character. Dr. David Chun's medical practice had thrived in the 10 years since he had moved to the area, and he had become as integral a part of the community as his wife for Rebecca Thornfield. Chun had indeed reclaimed her birth name when they married in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church in the spring of 1988, surrounded by the people who had helped sustain them both through their trials. The bookshop remained under Margaret Whitmore's name, partly for practical reasons and partly because the people of Cedar Falls had always known her by that name and saw no reason to change. But Rebecca had found peace with the dual identity, understanding finally that names were less important than the connections and commitments that gave life meaning. Betty Morrison still worked at the shop 3 days a week, though she was now technically the assistant manager, and handled much of the day-to-day operations. This allowed Rebecca more time to pursue the writing project that had been growing in her mind for several years, a memoir about identity, community, and the courage required to build a meaningful life from the fragments of a shattered past. "Are you going to tell the whole story?" Betty asked one quiet afternoon as they worked together to unpack a shipment of new books. "I'm going to tell my story," Rebecca replied. "The truth about what happened, but also the truth about what came after. About how people can heal and find happiness even after terrible things have happened to them." The memoir, when it was eventually published, would become a modest success, not a bestseller, but the kind of book that found its way to people who needed to read it. People who were struggling with their own questions about identity, belonging, and the possibility of starting over. Sheriff Garrett had been elected to his third term the previous year, running unopposed as he had for the past decade. His steady competence and genuine care for the community had made him one of those public servants that people rarely thought about because he did his job so well that problems were solved before they became crises. He still stopped by the bookshop regularly, and his conversations with Rebecca about mystery novels had evolved into a friendship that encompassed much more than literature. When he needed advice about anything from personnel issues to community disputes, Rebecca was often the person he consulted, knowing that her unique perspective on human nature and her deep investment in the town's well-being would help him find the right approach. Father O'Connor had retired 2 years earlier, replaced by a younger priest who continued the tradition of welcoming anyone who needed spiritual comfort, regardless of their particular beliefs or background. Rebecca still attended evening services occasionally, drawn not by dogma, but by the peace she found in the communal acknowledgement of forces larger than individual concerns. Sister Mary Catherine visited every year, usually in the early fall when the mountains were at their most beautiful. These visits had evolved from pastoral care into genuine friendship, as the two women shared their experiences of aging, growing, and learning to find meaning in lives that had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances. "You've built something beautiful here," Sister Mary Catherine observed during her 1997 visit, as they sat on the porch of Rebecca and David's house, a modest place they had bought 3 blocks from the bookshop, with a garden that David tended with the same careful attention he gave to his patients. "We've built it together," Rebecca replied. "All of us. It's not just my life. It's a community life that we all contribute to and benefit from." The house itself reflected the balance that Rebecca and David had found between privacy and connection. It was comfortable but not ostentatious, with plenty of books and a reading room where David could pursue his hobby of researching local history. But it was also designed for hosting, with a dining room where they regularly entertained friends and colleagues, and a garden where community meetings and informal gatherings often took place. Their marriage had been a source of quiet happiness for both of them, built on a foundation of shared values and complementary strengths, rather than dramatic passion. They had found in each other the kind of deep compatibility that allowed them to grow both individually and together, supporting each other's interests while maintaining their own distinct identities. They had not had children, a decision they had reached together after long conversations about the complexities of Rebecca's past and David's demanding medical practice. But they had found other ways to nurture the future, through David's mentorship of young doctors and Rebecca's informal guidance of people who came to the bookshop seeking not just books but wisdom about life's challenges. The anniversary of Margaret's disappearance had become an unofficial day of reflection in Cedar Falls, not marked by formal ceremonies, but acknowledged in small ways throughout the community. People would stop by the bookshop just to check in with Rebecca, or mention to David how glad they were that everything had worked out, or simply take a moment to appreciate the ordinary miracle of a community that had pulled together to protect one of its own. Detective Morrison had retired from the state police and moved to a small town not far from Cedar Falls, where he pursued his own passion for writing mystery novels that drew on his years of experience in law enforcement, but were infused with the understanding of human nature that cases like Margaret's had taught him. He still visited occasionally, drawn by curiosity about how the central characters in one of his most memorable cases were continuing their story. These visits had evolved into genuine friendship, particularly with David, who shared his interest in the psychological aspects of crime and justice. On one such visit in the summer of 1997, Detective Morrison asked Rebecca about something that had always puzzled him about the case. "You never seemed bitter about what Catherine Blackwood put you through," he observed as they sat in the bookshop after closing time, sharing tea and watching the evening light fade over the mountains. "Even during her trial, you testified with more sadness than anger. How do you manage that?" Rebecca thought for a long time before answering, watching the last light disappear behind the peaks. "I think," she said finally, "that bitterness is just another kind of prison." Catherine Blackwood spent 16 years consumed by anger and revenge, and look where it led her. I had already spent 16 years running from the past. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life being defined by other people's choices. "But surely you must have been angry," Detective Morrison pressed. "Oh, I was furious," Rebecca admitted, "especially in the first few months after her arrest. But anger is like a fire. It can warm you for a while, but if you let it burn too long, it consumes everything around it. I had too much to be grateful for to let anger eat away at my happiness." She gestured around the bookshop with its carefully arranged shelves and comfortable reading chairs, then toward the windows that showed the peaceful streets of Cedar Falls in the gathering dusk. "This life, this community, David, all of it could have been destroyed if I had let Catherine Blackwood's hatred infect my own heart. She took enough from me 16 years ago. I wasn't going to let her take anything more." It was, Detective Morrison reflected as he drove home that evening, perhaps the most profound statement about justice and healing that he had heard in 30 years of law enforcement. Rebecca had found a way to reclaim not just her safety and her identity, but her capacity for joy and connection. She had refused to let trauma define her future. As 1997 moved toward winter, Rebecca found herself thinking often about the strange journey that had brought her to this point in her life. She was 54 years old, married to her first love, surrounded by a community that valued her contributions, and engaged in work that brought her daily satisfaction. The young woman who had worked as a secretary at Blackwood Industries seemed like someone from another lifetime, not because Rebecca had forgotten her, but because that woman's courage and integrity had been transformed into something larger and more sustainable. The evening walks that had once been a symptom of insomnia and anxiety were now a shared pleasure that she and David enjoyed together, a way of staying connected to the rhythms of the town and to each other. Cedar Falls looked different in the darkness, now not like a place where she was hiding, but like a place where she was truly home. Sometimes on particularly clear nights, they would walk all the way to the edge of town where the forest began, standing together in the mountain silence and marveling at the density of stars visible in the unpolluted sky. It was during one of these walks, in November of 1997, that Rebecca articulated something she had been thinking about for months. "I want to tell you something," she said to David as they stood beneath the vast canopy of stars, their breath visible in the cold air. "What's that?" "I'm happy," she said simply. "Not just content, not just grateful, actually, genuinely happy. For the first time since 1971, I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly the person I want to be with, doing exactly what I want to be doing." David took her hand, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way back to each other across 16 years of separation and uncertainty. "I love you, Rebecca Thornfield Chun," David said softly. "I love you." "Too," she replied. All of me loves all of you, Rebecca and Margaret. Past and present, everything we were and everything we've become. As they walked back toward town, past the bookshop with its welcoming light still glowing in the window, past the houses where their neighbors slept peacefully, past all the landmarks of the life they had built together, Rebecca felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not just survived difficult circumstances, but had transformed them into something beautiful. The mystery of Margaret Whitmore's disappearance had been solved 10 years ago, but the story of Rebecca Thornfield Chun continued to unfold each day, enriched by community, sustained by love, and guided by the hard-won wisdom that comes from learning to build happiness from the ground up. In the end, that might be the most important mystery of all, not how people disappear, but how they find their way back to themselves and to the connections that make life worth living. Cedar Falls slept peacefully in the mountain darkness. Another day completed in a place where people were allowed to become their truest selves. Supported by neighbors who understood that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are the ones we live quietly. Surrounded by ordinary grace. And in the bookshop, surrounded by thousands of stories, the light continued to glow through the night. A beacon of welcome, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that some mysteries end not with dramatic revelations, but with the gentle triumph of people choosing to care for each other through all of life's uncertainties. The story of Margaret Whitmore had ended with her disappearance and discovery. The story of Rebecca Thornfield Chun continued with each new dawn, each shared meal, each conversation between friends, each book recommended to a customer seeking exactly the story they needed to read. Some endings are really beginnings, and some mysteries are solved not by detectives, but by communities that understand that the deepest questions about human life can only be answered through the patient practice of love. The morning fog hung over Beacon Bay like a soft gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the waking town. Sarah Chun had always loved these September mornings, when the air carried just a hint of autumn's approach and the tourists had finally retreated, leaving the coastal village to its year-round residents. Sarah pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Beacon Bay Public Library at exactly 8:30, just as she had every weekday for the past 7 years. The familiar scent of old books and lemon oil greeted her, along with the comfortable silence that libraries seem to hold. In their very walls, she moved through her opening routine with practiced ease, switching on the lights, checking the overnight book return, adjusting the temperature. It was a ritual that brought her peace, this quiet preparation for another day of helping people find the stories they were looking for. The library had been built in 1892, a Victorian brick building, with tall windows that looked out toward the harbor. Sarah often imagined the countless stories these walls had witnessed. Children discovering their first favorite books, teenagers hiding from the world in the poetry section, elderly residents researching their family histories. This particular morning, as Sarah sorted through the returned books, she noticed something unusual. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the town's retired postmaster and one of the library's most regular patrons, had returned a book that Sarah didn't recognize. The volume was bound in dark leather, its spine unmarked by any title or author's name. Sarah frowned slightly, turning the book over in her hands. It felt old, genuinely old, not like the reproduction antique books that sometimes found there, way into donations. The leather was soft with age, and the pages, when she carefully opened the cover, had that distinctive cream color that comes only with decades of careful aging. But what caught her attention immediately was the handwriting. On the first page, in careful, old-fashioned script, someone had written, "The private records of Thomas Whitmore, lighthouse keeper, Beacon Bay Light Station, 1963 to 1987. Sarah's breath caught slightly. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in Beacon Bay knew about Thomas Whitmore. He had been the lighthouse keeper for over 20 years, living alone in the small cottage attached to the lighthouse that still stood sentinel on Rocky Point, about 2 miles from town. when automated systems replaced the need for a full-time keeper in 1987, Thomas had simply disappeared. The official story, the one everyone in town knew, was that Thomas had moved away to live with relatives. He'd been a quiet man, kept to himself, and when the lighthouse was automated, he'd packed up his few belongings and left town. No one had been particularly surprised. After all, what would a lighthouse keeper do in a world that no longer needed lighthouse keepers? But now, sitting in the early morning quiet of the library, Sarah found herself holding what appeared to be Thomas Whitmore's personal journal. How had it ended up in Mrs. Hartwell's possession? And why had she returned it to the library as if it were just another borrowed book? Sarah glanced at the clock. She had an hour before the library officially opened. Plenty of time to satisfy her curiosity. She settled into her favorite reading chair, the one positioned near the large window that looked out toward the harbor, and carefully opened Thomas Whitmore's journal. The first entry was dated September 3rd, 1963. Today I begin my duties as keeper of the Beacon Bay Light. The cottage is smaller than I expected, but clean and well maintained. The lighthouse mechanism is in excellent condition. My predecessor, Harold Morrison, took great pride in his work, and it shows. The beam reaches 18 nautical miles on a clear night. I've been told the fog can be thick here, sometimes lasting for days. I look forward to the challenge. Sarah smiled softly. The writing revealed a man who took his responsibilities seriously, someone who understood the vital importance of his work. In 1963, before GPS and modern navigation systems, lighthouse keepers were quite literally the difference between life and death for ships. Approaching the rocky coastline, she turned the page, settling deeper into her chair as the fog continued to drift past the windows. September 5th, 10th, 1963. The fog rolled in yesterday evening and hasn't lifted. I've been running the horn every 30 seconds, as protocol requires. The sound echoes strangely in this weather. Sometimes I think I hear voices calling back. But of course it's just the acoustics playing tricks. Mrs. Patterson from the village bought supplies this morning. Kind woman. She mentioned there are stories about lights being seen from ships when the lighthouse wasn't operational, back in the early days. Local folklore, she says, but told with such conviction I almost believe her. The entries continued in this vein for several pages. Routine observations about weather, ships spotted offshore, maintenance tasks completed. Thomas Whitmore came across as methodical, dedicated, perhaps a bit lonely, but not unhappy. Sarah found his voice soothing, his careful attention to detail, painting a picture of a man who found meaning in his solitary work. But as she read on, she began to notice subtle changes in the tone of the entries. October 12, 1963. Strange night last night. The fog was particularly thick, and I was running the light as usual. Around midnight, I thought I saw another light offshore, not a ship, but stationary, as if someone had lit a bonfire on the water. But when I looked through the telescope, there was nothing there. Must have been reflection from the lighthouse beam, though I've never noticed such a thing before. October 18, 1963. The light appeared again. This time I was certain it was definitely not a reflection. A steady, warm glow about 2 miles offshore, in an area where the water is far too deep for any kind of platform or structure. I watched for nearly an hour before it simply faded away. I've checked all my charts and records. There should be nothing there. Sarah paused, glancing up from the journal to look out toward the harbor. Even through the morning fog, she could make out the lighthouse on Rocky Point, its white tower standing tall against the gray sky. During the day, it looked perfectly ordinary, even quaint. But reading Thomas's words, she tried to imagine what it would be like to spend night after night alone in that tower, watching for ships and seeing what? Lights that shouldn't exist. She returned to the journal, drawn deeper into Thomas Whitmore's increasingly puzzling observations. November 2nd, 1963. I've seen the light 7 times now. Always during heavy fog, always in the same location. Tonight, I decided to try something. When the light appeared, I began flashing the lighthouse beam in a pattern. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. The international distress signal. To my amazement, the offshore light began to flash back. The same pattern, perfectly synchronized. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. But then it added something more. A series of rapid flashes I couldn't decode. By the time I found my signal lamp to respond, the light had vanished. Sarah felt a small chill run down her spine. She glanced around the empty library, suddenly very aware of the silence surrounding her. The fog outside seemed to be growing thicker, pressing against the windows like something alive. November 5th, 10th, 1963. I've been researching the history of this area, looking for any record of ships lost offshore, any explanation for the lights I've been seeing. The town records go back to 1847, when Beacon Bay was first incorporated. There have been 17 ships wrecked on the rocks below the lighthouse over the years, most during storms, a few in heavy fog. But I found something interesting in the records from 1923. The lighthouse keeper at that time, a man named James Morrison, Harold's father, reported seeing unusual maritime activity during fog conditions. His reports were officially dismissed as atmospheric phenomena, but reading between the lines, I think he saw the same lights I'm seeing now. Sarah made a mental note to check the library's local history collection later. If there were other reports of mysterious lights, they might be documented somewhere in the newspaper archives or town meeting minutes. Asterisk. December 1st, 1963. Last night was the clearest communication yet. The offshore light appeared just after 11 p.m., and this time I was ready with my signal lamp. I began with the International Maritime greeting. Short, long, short. The response was immediate and perfectly executed. We spoke for nearly 2 hours, using basic maritime light signals. Whoever or whatever is producing that light has extensive knowledge of nautical communication codes. They asked questions about the date, about the town, about ships in the area. I answered as best I could. But when I asked who they were, the light simply disappeared. December 10th, 1963. I've been thinking about what to do with this information. Who would believe me? The Coast Guard would likely dismiss it as stress or isolation-induced hallucinations. The townspeople would think I've gone mad from too many solitary nights in the tower. But I know what I've seen, and I know these communications are real. I've decided to keep careful records of every encounter. Perhaps someday, someone will need this information. Sarah looked up from the journal, her mind racing. Thomas Whitmore had been documenting what sounded like regular contact with some kind of intelligence offshore. The rational part of her mind suggested various explanations, other ships using the fog as cover for smuggling, atmospheric phenomena, even elaborate pranks. But Thomas himself had been experienced in maritime matters. Surely he would have considered and ruled out the obvious explanations. The library's old heating system clicked on, making her jump slightly. She checked the time, nearly 9:30. In 30 minutes, the first patrons of the day would begin arriving. But she found herself reluctant to close the journal. Thomas Whitmore's story was drawing her in, and she had the strange feeling that this was only the beginning. She flipped ahead a few pages, looking for entries from later in his tenure. The handwriting remained steady, but the content became increasingly extraordinary. March 17th, 1964. Spring arrived early this year, but the fog has been heavier than usual. Last night's communication lasted 4 hours, the longest yet. Through patient exchange of signals, I learned something remarkable. The intelligence I've been communicating with claims to represent a community of people who have been living offshore for many years. When I asked how this was possible, they showed me. The light began moving, slowly at first, then more rapidly. It traced a pattern on the water, a perfect circle, perhaps half a mile in diameter. As it moved, I could see that it wasn't just a single light, but many lights, all moving in formation. They formed shapes, patterns, even what looked like simple pictures. A fish, a bird, a star. It was beautiful and impossible, and absolutely real. When they finished their demonstration, I flashed a single question: "Who are you?" The response came not in light signals, but in something I can barely describe. The entire circle of lights began to pulse in unison, and somehow, I cannot explain how, I understood their answer. "We are those who were lost," they signaled. "We are those who found a different way home." Sarah closed the journal gently, her hands trembling slightly. She needed time to process what she had read, and the library would be opening soon. But one thing was certain: Thomas Whitmore's journal raised far more questions than it answered. How had these records ended up with Mrs. Hartwell? What had happened to Thomas himself? And were the mysterious lights he described still appearing offshore during foggy nights? As if in response to her thoughts, the fog outside grew even thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the automated foghorn from the lighthouse, its steady rhythm unchanged since Thomas Whitmore's time. Sarah carefully placed the journal in her desk drawer, locked it, and began preparing for the day ahead. But she knew that tonight, when her shift ended and darkness fell over Beacon Bay, she would be watching the waters offshore with new interest. After all, if Thomas Whitmore's records were accurate, she might not be watching alone. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities that felt anything but routine. Sarah found herself glancing toward the harbor every few minutes, half expecting to see unexplained lights even in broad daylight. When Mrs. Patterson, the same Mrs. Patterson mentioned in Thomas's journal, though considerably older now, stopped by to return a cookbook, Sarah had to resist the urge to immediately ask about the lighthouse keeper. Instead, she waited until the afternoon lull, when the library was nearly empty except for young Timothy Rodriguez doing homework at one of the corner tables and Mr. Jameson dozing in the periodical section with a copy of National Geographic draped across his chest. Sarah made her way to the local history section, a collection of materials that had been largely her own project over the past few years. She had systematically gathered old newspapers, town records, photograph collections, and oral histories from longtime residents. If there were other reports of unusual activity offshore, this would be where she'd find them. The newspaper archives were stored in bound volumes, organized by year, and kept in a climate-controlled cabinet. Sarah pulled the volume containing the Beacon Bay Gazette from 1923, looking for any mention of James Morrison or unusual maritime activity. The Beacon Bay Gazette had been a weekly publication in those days, usually running 4 pages with local news, ship arrivals and departures, social events, and advertisements for everything from patent medicines to farm equipment. Sarah flipped through the issues, skimming headlines and scanning for Morrison's name. She found it in the October 10th, 1923 edition, buried in a column titled Harbor Notes. Lighthouse keeper James Morrison reports unusual atmospheric conditions. Offshore have been creating optical illusions during recent fog banks. Mariners are advised that reflected light phenomena may appear to be signals or navigation aids, but should not be relied upon for safe passage. All vessels should maintain standard fog protocols regardless of apparent light sources not officially documented on maritime charts. Sarah read the notice twice, her pulse quickening. It was clearly an official statement, probably issued at the request of the Coast Guard or harbor master. But reading between the lines, just as Thomas Whitmore had suggested, it seemed to confirm that James Morrison had been seeing the same mysterious lights. She continued searching, finding 2 more brief mentions in the following months. November 12, 1923, the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant conducted routine inspection of waters offshore from Rocky Point. No irregularities observed. December 3, 1923. Harbor Master William Thorne requests all fishing vessels report any unusual activity or uncharted lights observed during fog conditions. Reports should be made to the Harbor Master's office for official documentation. Then, abruptly, the mentions stopped. Sarah checked the remaining issues from 1923 and the first few months of 1924, but found no further reference to unusual maritime activity or James Morrison's reports. She made photocopies of the relevant articles and returned the bound volume to its place, then moved on to the town meeting minutes from the same period. These records were less complete. Some years were missing entirely, and many entries were barely legible handwritten notes. But she persevered, and her patience was rewarded. In the minutes from the November 10th, 1923 Town Council meeting, she found this entry: motion made by Councilman Edwards to request Coast Guard investigation of reported unusual activity offshore. Motion seconded by Councilman Price. Discussion followed regarding lighthouse keeper Morrison's reports. Harbor Master Thorne advised council that while no definitive explanation had been found, no threat to navigation or public safety had been established. Motion tabled pending further information. The December meeting minutes contained only this brief note: Councilman Edwards withdrew motion regarding offshore investigation. No further action required. Sarah sat back in her chair, studying the photocopied documents spread before her. The pattern was clear. Lighthouse keepers in two different eras had reported the same phenomenon. Official investigations had been requested, but apparently yielded no public results, and then the matter had been quietly dropped. Asterisk, what had the Coast Guard found during their inspection in 1923? Why had Councilman Edwards withdrawn his motion? And why had both James Morrison and Thomas Whitmore felt the need to document their experiences in such detail? She glanced at the clock. Nearly 4 p.m. The library would be closing in an hour. Timothy had left to catch the school bus, and Mr. Jameson had awakened from his nap and shuffled out with a friendly wave. The fog had lifted somewhat during the afternoon, but it was already beginning to thicken again as evening approached. Sarah made a decision. After closing the library, she would drive out to Rocky Point and take a closer look at the lighthouse and the surrounding area. Maybe she would even stay for a while after dark to see if the mysterious lights still appeared during foggy nights. But first, she wanted to speak with Mrs. Hartwell about the journal. Eleanor Hartwell lived in a small cottage on Elm Street, about 4 blocks from the library. Sarah had visited her several times over the years, usually to pick up books that Mrs. Hartwell had finished reading, but was too frail to return in person. The elderly woman had been the town's postmaster for 37 years before retiring, and her memory for local events and personalities was legendary. Sarah knocked on the front door, inhaling the scent of Mrs. Hartwell's famous rose garden. The cottage was painted yellow with white trim, surrounded by carefully tended flower beds that were the envy of every other gardener in town. Asterisk, Sarah, dear. Mrs. Hartwell opened the door with a warm smile. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair always perfectly arranged, and bright blue eyes that missed nothing. How lovely to see you. Come in, come in. I just put the kettle on. The interior of the cottage was exactly what Sarah had expected: cozy, meticulously clean, and filled with books. Every wall held built-in shelves packed with volumes on every conceivable subject. Mrs. Hartwell had been a voracious reader her entire life, and retirement had only increased her appetite for books. I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced, Sarah said, settling into a floral print armchair near the fireplace. I wanted to ask you about a book you returned this morning. Mrs. Hartwell paused in the doorway to the kitchen, her expression growing suddenly cautious. A book? Which book would that be, dear? The leather-bound journal. There was no title on the cover, but inside it appeared to be the personal records of Thomas Whitmore, the old lighthouse keeper. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, then walked slowly back into the living room and sank into her own chair across from Sarah. She looked older suddenly, as if the mention of the journal had added years to her features. I wondered when someone would come asking about that, she said softly. I probably should have spoken to you when I returned it, but, well, some stories are difficult to tell. The kettle began whistling in the kitchen, but Mrs. Hartwell made no move to attend to it. She sat staring at her hands folded in her lap, as if gathering courage. Thomas Whitmore didn't just disappear when the lighthouse was automated, she said finally. He came to see me 2 days before he left town. He brought me that journal, along with several other items, and asked me to keep them safe. Other items? Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. Photographs, charts, letters. He said someday someone would need to know the truth about what he'd experienced out at the lighthouse. He made me promise to wait at least 20 years before sharing any of it, to make sure he was gone and couldn't be harmed by what people might think. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Harmed? What did he think would happen to him? He was frightened, Sarah. Genuinely frightened. Not of what he'd been seeing offshore. He'd grown comfortable with that over the years. He was afraid of what certain people in town might do if they learned about his communications. The whistling kettle grew more insistent, but both women ignored it. Mrs. Hartwell seemed lost in memories, her eyes distant. Thomas told me he'd been in contact with them for over 20 years, the lights offshore. He said they weren't dangerous, just different. Lost souls who had found a way to stay together, to help ships navigate safely through the fog. But he also said there were others who knew about them, people who wanted to use them somehow or drive them away. What others? Mrs. Hartwell stood up abruptly, moving toward the kitchen. Let me make that tea, dear. This is going to be a long conversation. While Mrs. Hartwell busied herself with the tea service, Sarah tried to process what she'd heard. Thomas Whitmore had been frightened enough to entrust his records to the postmaster and disappear entirely. But frightened of whom? And what did Mrs. Hartwell mean about people wanting to use the mysterious lights? Mrs. Hartwell returned with a tray containing a delicate china tea service and a plate of shortbread cookies. She poured 2 cups and handed one to Sarah before settling back into her chair. Thomas first came to me in 1975, she said, picking up her narrative as if there had been no interruption. He'd been lighthouse keeper for 12 years by then, and he said he needed someone he could trust. Someone who would listen without judgment and keep his confidence. You were the postmaster then. He must have felt you were trustworthy. That was part of it, but there was something else. Mrs. Hartwell sipped her tea, choosing her words carefully. My brother Michael was lost at sea in 1962. Fishing boat went down in a storm about 3 miles, offshore from Rocky Point. They never found the boat or Michael. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Thomas thought the lights might be connected to people who were lost at sea. He was convinced of it. He'd been communicating with them for years, and gradually he learned to understand their more complex signals. According to Thomas, they were indeed people who had died in shipwrecks over the decades, but somehow they had found a way to remain present, to continue helping ships navigate safely through dangerous waters. Mrs. Hartwell set down her teacup with hands that trembled slightly. Thomas said he could communicate with Michael. That Michael was there, offshore, with the others. He offered to relay messages. Sarah could only imagine what that offer must have meant to a woman who had lost her brother at sea. Did you did you take him up on it? Mrs. Hartwell nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Several times over the years, Thomas would go out to the lighthouse on nights when the fog was thick, and he would carry messages back and forth. Michael told me he was at peace, that he was doing important work, helping other vessels navigate safely. It gave me such comfort, but something changed. You said Thomas became frightened. Mrs. Hartwell's expression darkened. In the early 1980s, There began to be talk around town about developing the waterfront. Big investors from Boston and New York interested in turning Beacon Bay into a resort destination. They wanted to build a marina, condominiums, restaurants. The lighthouse property was part of their plans. Sarah nodded. She remembered hearing about the development controversy, though she'd been just a child at the time. Thomas was concerned about what increased boat traffic and construction might do to the community offshore. But there was something else. He'd begun to suspect that some of the developers knew about the lights and saw them as a potential tourist attraction. Mysterious lights offshore, ghost ships, supernatural maritime phenomena. It would be a perfect marketing hook. That doesn't sound necessarily harmful. Mrs. Hartwell shook her head grimly. Thomas said the offshore community was very sensitive to disruption. Too much attention, too many boats searching for them, bright lights from construction projects. It could force them to move away or even cease to exist entirely. She reached for a small wooden box on the side table next to her chair. Thomas left this with me as well. He said if anyone ever came asking about the journal, I should show them what's inside. She handed the box to Sarah, who opened it carefully. Inside were several items, old black and white photographs, what appeared to be nautical charts marked with handwritten notes, and a single sheet of paper covered in symbols that looked like a code. Sarah picked up one of the photographs. It showed the lighthouse at night, its beam cutting through thick fog. But there, clearly visible in the water beyond, were multiple points of light arranged in a perfect circle. Thomas took these photographs over several years, Mrs. Hartwell explained. He wanted proof that he wasn't imagining things. Sarah examined the other photographs. Each showed the same phenomenon from slightly different angles: the lighthouse beam, the fog, and the mysterious formation of lights offshore. In one image, the lights appeared to be moving, creating blurred trails across the water's surface. The nautical charts were even more intriguing. Someone, presumably Thomas, had marked locations where the lights appeared, noting dates, weather conditions, and the duration of each sighting. The markings covered a period of more than 20 years, showing a consistent pattern of activity in a specific area about 2 miles offshore. But it was the sheet of symbols that truly captured Sarah's attention. They were arranged in rows, like lines of text, but unlike any alphabet she recognized. Some symbols were simple geometric shapes, circles, triangles, wavy lines. Others were more complex, resembling mathematical equations or scientific notations. Thomas said this was their written language, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. He learned to recognize some of the basic symbols over the years. This particular message was given to him just before he left town. ****. Mrs. Hartwell smiled sadly. According to Thomas, it says, "Thank you for your friendship. We will wait for the next keeper of the light." Sarah stared at the symbols, trying to imagine the years of patient communication that had led to such understanding between Thomas Whitmore and the mysterious offshore community. "Mrs. Hartwell, do you think they're still out there?" "I don't know, dear. Thomas left town in 1987, and I haven't been out to the lighthouse since then. The property has been maintained by the Coast Guard, but there's been no full-time keeper to watch for the lights or maintain communication." Sarah carefully replaced the items in the wooden box. "Why did you decide to return the journal to the library now? You said Thomas asked you to wait 20 years, but it's been over 30. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, gazing out the window toward the harbor where the fog was growing thicker as evening approached. "Last week I saw something. I was sitting in my garden just after sunset, and I looked toward the water. For just a moment, I thought I saw lights moving offshore. Not boat lights, something else. Something that reminded me of Thomas's photographs." She turned to face Sarah directly. "I think they're still there. And if they are, then someone should know about them. Someone should continue Thomas's work of watching and communicating." The journal found its way to you for a reason, Sarah. Maybe you're meant to be the next keeper of their story. As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of the automated foghorn began its steady rhythm, echoing across the increasingly misty harbor. Sarah felt a strange combination of excitement and apprehension. She had come looking for answers about a mysterious journal, and instead had discovered a story that stretched back decades, involving unexplained phenomena that might still be active today. Mrs. Hartwell, would you mind if I borrowed these other items as well? I'd like to study them more carefully. Of course, dear. Take whatever you need. But Sarah... Mrs. Hartwell's voice grew serious. Thomas was right to be careful about who he trusted with this information. Not everyone in town would welcome the idea of mysterious lights offshore, especially if there's still interest in waterfront development. Be careful who you share this with. Sarah nodded, tucking the wooden box under her arm along with her photocopied newspaper articles. I will, and thank you for trusting me with Thomas's story. As she walked home through the thickening fog, Sarah found herself looking repeatedly toward the harbor. Somewhere out there, if Thomas Whitmore and Eleanor Hartwell were to be believed, an entire community of lost souls continued their eternal watch over the waters of Beacon Bay. Tonight, she decided she would drive out to Rocky Point and see for herself if the lighthouse keeper's secret was still waiting to be discovered. Asterisk. Sarah spent the early evening reviewing Thomas Whitmore's journal more thoroughly, cross-referencing his entries with the photographs and charts Mrs. Hartwell had entrusted to her. The more she studied the materials, the more convinced she became that Thomas had been documenting something genuinely extraordinary. The photographs were particularly compelling. While she was no expert in photographic analysis, they appeared authentic. The grain structure and coloration were consistent with the time period, and there were no obvious signs of manipulation or double exposure. The lights captured in the images were clearly distinct from any known maritime lighting, forming patterns and movements that defied conventional explanation. The nautical charts told an even more detailed story. Thomas had meticulously recorded not just the location and timing of each sighting, but also weather conditions, moon phases, and the status of nearby shipping traffic. Sarah noticed several interesting patterns emerging from his data. The lights appeared most frequently during thick fog conditions, typically between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. They were most active during new moon periods, when natural darkness was at its deepest. And there seemed to be seasonal variations, more frequent appearances during autumn and winter months, fewer during spring and summer. Most intriguingly, Thomas had noted a correlation between the appearance of the lights and subsequent safe passage of vessels through the hazardous waters around Rocky Point. On nights when the lights appeared, ships reported unusually clear navigation despite heavy fog conditions. Several entries mentioned vessels that had been guided safely around underwater rocks or dangerous currents. By 7:30, Sarah had made her decision. She packed Thomas's journal, the photographs, and a thermos of coffee into a canvas bag, then drove her small Honda out of town toward Rocky Point. The lighthouse road was a narrow, winding lane that followed the coastline for about 2 miles before ending at a small parking area near the lighthouse grounds. Sarah had driven this route many times during her years in Beacon Bay. It was a popular spot for tourists and locals alike to watch sunsets and take photographs of the historic lighthouse. But tonight, with fog rolling in from the ocean and darkness beginning to settle over the water, the familiar route felt different, more isolated, more mysterious. Sarah parked in the small gravel lot and sat for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sound of waves against the rocks below and the steady pulse of the automated foghorn. The lighthouse itself was a white cylindrical tower about 60 feet tall, topped with the automated light system that had replaced Thomas Whitmore's manual operation. The keeper's cottage where Thomas had lived stood nearby, a small but sturdy building that had been maintained by the Coast Guard, but remained unoccupied. Sarah could see why someone might feel lonely living out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and on nights like this, with fog obscuring everything beyond a few yards, the isolation would be complete. She gathered her supplies and walked toward the lighthouse, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the rocky path. The beam of the lighthouse swept overhead every 10 seconds, its modern LED array much brighter than the incandescent bulbs. Thomas would have tended. Sarah found a relatively comfortable spot on a large flat rock about 50 yards from the lighthouse, positioned so she had a clear view of the water where Thomas's charts indicated the mysterious lights typically appeared. She poured coffee from her thermos, opened Thomas's journal to review his detailed descriptions of the phenomena, and settled in to wait. The fog continued to thicken as full darkness fell over Beacon Bay. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to perhaps 20 yards, and the lighthouse beam seemed to create more of a glow than an actual beam as it swept through the moisture-laden air. Sarah found the conditions oddly peaceful. The sound of the waves provided a steady rhythm, punctuated by the foghorn's regular pulse. Occasionally, she could hear the distant sound of a ship's horn as vessels navigated the shipping channel several miles offshore. But otherwise, the night was remarkably quiet. She used her phone to check the time, 9:45 p.m. According to Thomas's records, if the lights were going to appear tonight, it would likely be within the next few hours. To pass the time, she continued, reading the journal, using her phone's light to illuminate the pages. Thomas's later entries revealed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of his mysterious correspondence. June 12, 1978. Tonight's communication session lasted nearly 5 hours, the longest yet. Through patient exchange of signals, I learned more about their origins and purpose. They confirmed what I had begun to suspect. They are indeed individuals who were lost at sea over many decades, but somehow found a way to remain present in this location. They described themselves as guardians of the passage, dedicated to preventing others from suffering their own fate. They showed me how they worked together to guide ships safely through dangerous waters. During heavy fog, they positioned themselves to create a pattern visible only to vessels in distress, leading them away from the underwater rocks and around the treacherous currents that have claimed so many lives over the years. It's remarkable and humbling to witness their dedication. I asked why they had chosen to reveal themselves to me, and the answer was simple. The lighthouse keeper has always been their natural ally. For over a century, lighthouse keepers have shared their mission of keeping mariners safe. They consider me a colleague in this work. Sarah paused in her reading, struck by the profound loneliness and responsibility Thomas must have felt. Night after night, tending the lighthouse alone, gradually discovering that he was not the only one watching over the dangerous waters around Rocky Point. She checked the time again, 10:20 p.m. The fog had grown even thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The lighthouse beam created an eerie glow overhead, and she could no longer see the cottage, or even her car in the parking area. It was then that she noticed something. At first, Sarah thought it might be a trick of her eyes, or perhaps the reflection of the lighthouse beam off the fog. But as she watched more carefully, she became certain that she was seeing a faint glow in the water, roughly in the direction where Thomas's charts indicated the mysterious lights typically appeared. Asterisk, her heart began to beat faster. She set down the journal and coffee thermos, then pulled out the small pair of binoculars she had brought along. Through the lenses, the glow became more distinct, not a single light source, but several points of soft, warm light moving slowly through the fog about 2 miles offshore. Sarah fumbled for her phone, trying to activate the camera, but the combination of fog, darkness, and distance made photography nearly impossible. Instead, she simply watched, mesmerized, as the lights moved in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Just as Thomas had described, the lights formed a rough circle in the water. They pulsed gently in unison, creating a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. As Sarah watched, the formation began to change shape, stretching into an oval, then contracting back to a circle, then spreading into a line before reforming once again. The display continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then gradually faded until Sarah could no longer distinguish the lights from the general darkness of the fog-shrouded ocean. She sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process what she had witnessed. Whatever Thomas Whitmore had been documenting in his journal, it was still happening. The mysterious lights were still there, still active, still performing their enigmatic dance in the waters off Rocky Point. Sarah checked her phone. 10:47 p.m. She made a mental note of the time, weather conditions, and duration of the sighting, just as Thomas had done for over 20 years. But now she faced the same dilemma that had confronted Thomas. What should she do with this information? Who would believe her? And more importantly, should she attempt to make contact? She remembered Thomas's description of his first successful communication, using the lighthouse beam to flash the international distress signal. But the lighthouse was now automated, its beam sweeping continuously in a pattern she couldn't control. Sarah did have a powerful flashlight in her car, one she used for camping trips. If the lights appeared again tonight, she could try using it to signal offshore. She made her way carefully back to the parking area, using her phone's light to navigate the rocky path. The fog was so thick now that she had to feel along the stone wall that bordered the lighthouse grounds to find her car. She retrieved the flashlight from her emergency kit and tested it. The beam was strong and focused, easily visible even in the heavy fog. She also grabbed a notebook from her glove compartment, wanting to document anything else she might observe. Back at her vantage point near the lighthouse, Sarah settled in to wait. If the lights appeared again, she would be ready. The minutes ticked by slowly. 11:15, 11:30, 11:45. Sarah began to wonder if she would see the lights again tonight, or if the single sighting had been all they intended to reveal. Then, just before midnight, the glow returned. This time, the lights appeared more quickly, forming their circular pattern in a matter of seconds rather than the gradual emergence she had observed earlier. They pulsed more brightly as well, as if responding to her presence and attention. Sarah took a deep breath, raised her flashlight toward the offshore lights, and began flashing the pattern Thomas had used decades ago. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The international distress signal. The response was immediate. The entire circle of lights began flashing in perfect unison. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the flashlight. They had answered her, just as they had answered Thomas Whitmore all those years ago. Following Thomas's example, she flashed the basic maritime greeting. Short, long, short. Again, the response was immediate and perfectly executed. Short, long, short. For the next hour, Sarah engaged in the most extraordinary conversation of her life. Using the basic light signals that Thomas had documented in his journal, she was able to establish rudimentary communication with the mysterious offshore community. They asked about her identity. She spelled out her name using maritime signal code. They asked about the date. She flashed the numbers for the current year. They asked about the town. She confirmed that it was still called Beacon Bay, but when she attempted to ask more complex questions about their nature or origins, the lights would pulse briefly and then fall silent for several minutes before resuming their basic patterns. Finally, near 1:30 a.m., the lights began to fade. But before they disappeared entirely, they performed one last display, moving to form letters in the water, spelling out a simple message that Sarah could read even through the fog. "Thank you." Then they were gone, leaving Sarah alone with the fog, the lighthouse beam, and the profound realization that she had just made contact with something truly extraordinary. She sat quietly for another hour, hoping the lights might return, but the ocean remained dark except for the automated sweep of the lighthouse. Finally, She packed her belongings and made her way back to her car. The drive home through the fog was slow and contemplative. Sarah's mind raced with questions and possibilities. She had confirmed that Thomas Whitmore's experiences were real and ongoing. But what should she do with this knowledge? By the time she reached her small apartment above the antique shop on Main Street, Sarah had made several decisions. First, she would continue Thomas's work of documenting the phenomena, maintaining detailed records of each sighting and communication. Second, she would research the local maritime history more thoroughly, looking for patterns that might explain the origins of the offshore community. And third, she would be very careful about whom she shared this information with, heeding both Thomas Whitmore's caution and Mrs. Hartwell's warnings about those who might not have the community's best interests at heart. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself looking forward to the next foggy night when she could return to Rocky Point and continue the conversations that Thomas Whitmore had begun decades ago. Outside her bedroom window, the foghorn continued its steady pulse, a reminder that somewhere offshore, the guardians of the passage were maintaining their eternal watch over the dangerous waters of Beacon Bay. Over the following weeks, Sarah established a routine that balanced her library duties with her new role as unofficial liaison to the mysterious offshore community. On nights when conditions were favorable, thick fog, minimal boat traffic, and new moon darkness, she would drive out to Rocky Point and attempt communication using her flashlight and the signal codes documented in Thomas Whitmore's journal. Not every attempt was successful. Sometimes the lights simply didn't appear, and Sarah would spend hours watching empty ocean through the fog. Other times, the lights would appear but remain distant and unresponsive, as if they were occupied with other activities she couldn't observe. But when communication was established, the conversations grew increasingly sophisticated. Through patient exchange of signals and symbols, Sarah began to understand more about the nature and purpose of her mysterious correspondents. They were, as Thomas had documented, individuals who had been lost at sea over many decades. But their continued existence was more complex than simple ghostly manifestation. According to their signals, they had collectively chosen to remain in this location, bound together by their shared dedication to preventing others from suffering similar fates. Sarah learned that their activities extended far beyond the simple light displays she had observed. During periods of dangerous weather or treacherous sea conditions, they worked together to guide vessels safely through the underwater hazards around Rocky Point. They could sense approaching storms hours before meteorological instruments detected them, and they maintained constant awareness of every ship, boat, or vessel that entered their area of responsibility. Most remarkably, they seemed to exist in a state that transcended normal time constraints. Individuals who had been lost decades apart were able to collaborate as if they had known each other for years. The community included fishermen from the 1920s, cargo ship crewmen from the 1940s, pleasure boaters from more recent years, and even several lighthouse keepers from the 19th century who had died in accidents while tending the beacon. Through careful questioning over multiple communication sessions, Sarah learned that the community's leader, if such terms applied to their collective existence, was a ship's captain named Marcus Thornfield, who had been lost during a severe storm in 1887. Captain Thornfield had been attempting to guide his cargo vessel around Rocky Point when a combination of high winds, heavy seas, and equipment failure had driven the ship onto the underwater rocks that still posed a hazard to modern navigation. According to the signals Sarah received, Captain Thornfield had been the first to discover that strong emotional connection to the sea, and dedication to maritime safety could allow consciousness to persist beyond physical death. Over the decades, he had guided other lost souls who shared similar dedication, gradually building the community that Thomas Whitmore had encountered. Sarah documented all of these communications in a new journal, following Thomas's example of maintaining detailed records. She also began expanding her research into the maritime history of Beacon Bay, looking for official records of ships and individuals lost in the waters around Rocky Point. The Beacon Bay Historical Society, housed in a small building adjacent to the library, contained extensive records of local maritime activity dating back to the town's founding. Sarah spent her lunch hours and free time poring over ship manifests, Coast Guard reports, and newspaper accounts of maritime accidents. What she discovered was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Over the past 150 years, at least 43 vessels had been lost or severely damaged in the waters around Rocky Point. The casualties ranged from small fishing boats caught in sudden storms to large cargo ships that had miscalculated the dangerous currents and rock formations. But Sarah also found something else, a pattern of unusually successful rescues and near miraculous navigational assistance during the most dangerous weather conditions. Time and again, ship captains reported being guided to safety by mysterious lights that appeared during fog or storms, only to disappear once the vessel had reached safe waters. The pattern was consistent enough that it had been noticed by maritime insurance companies, which had gradually reduced their risk assessments for the Beacon Bay area despite the known navigational hazards. Several insurance documents from the 1950s specifically mentioned unexplained positive factors that seemed to reduce accident rates around Rocky Point. Sarah began to realize that Thomas Whitmore's communications with the offshore community had been just one part of a much larger story of ongoing interaction between the living and the lost along this stretch of coastline. One evening in late October, during a particularly successful communication session, Sarah decided to ask the offshore community about Thomas Whitmore himself. Using a combination of signals and spelled-out words, she inquired about the former lighthouse keeper's current status. The response was immediate and emotional. The lights pulsed in rapid patterns that conveyed unmistakable excitement and joy. Over the next hour, through careful questioning, Sarah learned that Thomas Whitmore had indeed joined the offshore community following his death in 1994. According to their signals, Thomas had spent his final years living quietly in a small town in Maine, but had never forgotten his friends offshore at Beacon Bay. When his time came, his dedication to maritime safety and his strong emotional connection to this location had allowed him to return and take his place among the guardians of the passage. The lights showed Sarah that Thomas was present during their communications, helping to translate complex concepts and serving as an intermediary between the living and the lost. Through him, she learned details about the community's activities that would have been impossible to communicate through simple light signals. Thomas conveyed that the community was aware of changes in the town over the decades since his official departure. They knew about the continuing development pressures, the increase in recreational boating, and the growing tourist interest in the lighthouse and surrounding areas. They were also aware that Sarah had been researching their history and appreciated her careful, respectful approach to understanding their existence. But Thomas also shared a growing concern. Recent changes in ocean temperature and current patterns, likely related to climate change, were affecting the delicate environmental conditions that allowed the community to maintain their presence. Additionally, increased boat traffic and underwater noise from modern vessels was making it more difficult for them to sense approaching dangers and communicate with ships in distress. Most worrying of all, Thomas signaled, there were indications that their existence was becoming known to people who might not respect their mission or understand their peaceful nature. Several times in recent months, boats had appeared in their area during daylight hours, using sonar equipment and underwater cameras as if searching for something specific. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what Thomas Whitmore had feared in the 1980s, that knowledge of the offshore community might attract the wrong kind of attention. But who would be searching for them now, and why? She asked Thomas for more details about the search activities, But the communication session was interrupted by the arrival of a Coast Guard cutter on routine patrol. The lights immediately faded, leaving Sarah alone with her flashlight and a growing sense of urgency. As she drove home through the fog, Sarah realized that her role as unofficial liaison to the offshore community was becoming more complex and potentially more dangerous. She was no longer just documenting an unusual phenomenon or maintaining a decades-old tradition of communication. She might be the only person in a position to protect a unique and vulnerable community from those who would exploit or harm them. But before she could take any protective action, she needed to understand who was searching for the lights and what they intended to do with the knowledge. The next morning, Sarah began making discreet inquiries around town, asking about recent maritime activity and research projects in the Beacon Bay area. What she learned over the following days would transform her understanding of the situation and force her to make some difficult decisions about how far she was willing to go to protect Thomas Whitmore's secret. Sarah's inquiries around town initially yielded little concrete information, but gradually a pattern began to emerge. Several residents mentioned seeing unfamiliar boats in the area over the past few months, vessels that didn't appear to be fishing, pleasure craft, or commercial traffic. These boats typically appeared during daylight hours and seemed to be conducting some kind of systematic search or survey of the waters around Rocky Point. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, a young marine biology graduate student who worked part-time at the Beacon Bay Marina, approached Sarah at the library one afternoon with questions about local maritime folklore. "I heard you've been researching the history of the lighthouse," Jake said, setting a stack of scientific journals on the circulation desk. "I'm working on a project about unexplained bioluminescent phenomena along the New England coast, and several people suggested I talk to you." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Bioluminescent phenomena? What kind of project? Jake explained that he was completing his master's thesis on unusual patterns of marine phosphorescence that had been reported by sailors and fishermen over many decades. His research had led him to several locations along the coast where consistent sightings of unexplained lights had been documented. "Beacon Bay is actually one of the most interesting sites I've found," Jake continued. "There are reports going back over a century of organized light patterns appearing offshore during specific weather conditions. Most scientists have dismissed them as folklore or misidentified natural phenomena, but the consistency of the reports suggests something more systematic." Sarah chose her words carefully. What kind of natural phenomena could create organized light patterns? That's what I'm trying to determine. Bioluminescent plankton can create spectacular displays under the right conditions, but usually they're random or triggered by disturbance in the water. The reports from this area describe lights that move in deliberate formations, respond to external stimuli, and appear according to predictable patterns. That's not typical of any known natural phenomenon. Jake pulled out a map of the local waters, marked with various notations and coordinates. "I've been collecting data for the past 6 months, trying to correlate sightings with environmental conditions. And here's the interesting part. I think I've identified the specific location where the phenomena occurs most consistently." He pointed to an area of the map about 2 miles offshore from Rocky Point, exactly where Thomas Whitmore's charts had indicated the mysterious lights typically appeared. "I've applied for a research grant to conduct underwater surveys of this area using sonar mapping and deep-sea cameras. If there's some kind of unique marine ecosystem creating these light displays, it could be a significant scientific discovery." Sarah felt a growing sense of alarm. Jake seemed to be a genuine researcher with purely scientific interests, but his investigation could inadvertently expose the offshore community to exactly the kind of attention Thomas Whitmore had feared. "Have you had any success in actually observing these light phenomena?" she asked. Shook his head with obvious frustration. That's been the most challenging aspect of the research. The lights apparently only appear during heavy fog conditions, usually late at night. I've spent dozens of nights out on the water with cameras and recording equipment, but the timing never seems to work out. Either there's no fog, or the fog is too thick for safe navigation, or I'm in the wrong location when they appear. But you mentioned other people have been searching the area recently. That's another interesting development. About 3 months ago, a private research company started conducting surveys in these same waters. They have much more sophisticated equipment than I can afford: commercial sonar arrays, underwater drones, even a small research submarine. I assumed they were working on the same phenomena I've been studying. Jake's expression grew troubled. But when I approached them to share data and possibly collaborate, they were very secretive about their work. They claimed to be conducting routine marine surveys for a development company, but their equipment and methods suggest they're looking for something much more specific. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. A development company? Did they mention? Which one? Coastal Heritage Development, based out of Boston. I looked them up online, and they specialize in luxury resort and marina projects. But their survey work around Rocky Point has been much more intensive than you'd expect for a standard site assessment. The name meant nothing to Sarah immediately, but the connection to development interests brought back memories of Mrs. Hartwell's warnings about people who might want to exploit the offshore community for commercial purposes. Jake, this research grant you mentioned, who would be funding it? That's actually another unusual coincidence. The funding is coming from a private foundation called the Maritime Phenomena Research Institute. They contacted me directly after reading some preliminary papers one published about bioluminescent anomalies. The grant would cover all my equipment costs, plus a substantial stipend, but it requires me to share all my findings with their research team. Jake pulled out a business card and handed it to Sarah. The foundation representative is Dr. Elena Vasquez. She's supposedly a marine biologist, but when I tried to look up her published research, I couldn't find much academic work under her name. Sarah studied the business card. The Maritime Phenomena Research Institute had a Boston address and a professional-looking logo, but something about the organization felt suspicious. Why would a private foundation be so interested in unexplained marine lights? And why approach a graduate student rather than established research institutions? Jake, can I ask you to do me a favor? Before you accept this grant or begin any underwater surveys, would you mind if I did some research into this foundation and the development company? I have some concerns about their motives. Jake looked puzzled but nodded. Of course. Is there something about them that worries you? Sarah chose her words carefully. Let's just say that this area has a complex history, and not everyone who shows interest in local phenomena has the community's best interests at heart. I'd like to make sure any research conducted here is done responsibly. After Jake left, Sarah immediately began researching both Coastal Heritage Development and the Maritime Phenomena Research Institute. What she discovered over the next few hours confirmed her worst fears about the motives behind the recent surge of interest in the offshore lights. Coastal Heritage Development was indeed a legitimate company specializing in luxury waterfront properties. But their recent projects had a troubling pattern. They typically focused on locations with unique natural phenomena that could be marketed as exclusive tourist attractions. Their resort in Bar Harbor featured mystical tide pools. Their Cape Cod property advertised ethereal morning mists, and their Martha's Vineyard development promised guests encounters with nature's most mysterious displays. The Maritime Phenomena Research Institute was more difficult to trace, but Sarah eventually found connections linking it to the same investors who controlled Coastal Heritage Development. The foundation appeared to be a front organization designed to fund research into unusual natural phenomena that could be incorporated into luxury tourism developments. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. If Sarah's analysis was correct, the recent search activities around Rocky Point were not legitimate scientific research, but rather corporate reconnaissance designed to locate and document the mysterious lights so they could be exploited as a tourist attraction. Sarah thought about the implications. Thomas Whitmore had feared exactly this scenario, the offshore community being discovered by people who saw them only as a commercial opportunity rather than understanding their true nature and purpose. According to Thomas's signals, the community was already being stressed by environmental changes and increased boat traffic. Intensive tourism focused specifically on observing their activities could disrupt their existence entirely. But what could Sarah do to prevent it? She was just a librarian with access to unusual information. The development companies had significant financial resources and legal rights to conduct marine surveys in public waters. Sarah realized she needed help, someone with more expertise in maritime law and environmental protection. She also needed to warn the offshore community about the increased scrutiny they were facing. That evening, despite marginal fog conditions, Sarah drove out to Rocky Point and attempted to establish communication with the offshore lights. It took nearly 2 hours of patient signaling, but eventually, she was able to make contact with Thomas Whitmore and convey her concerns about the recent research activities. Thomas's response, transmitted through the complex light patterns the community had developed over decades, was both grateful and alarming. The offshore guardians were indeed aware of the increased boat traffic and search activities. They had already been forced to limit their appearances and modify their usual patterns of assistance to ships in distress. More concerning, Thomas signaled that the community's collective strength was beginning to weaken under the stress of constant observation and the disruption of their normal activities. If the intensive scrutiny continued, they might be forced to abandon their century-long mission of protecting vessels in the dangerous waters around Rocky Point. Sarah asked what she could do to help, and Thomas's response was clear: find a way to stop the research activities before they succeeded in fully documenting and locating the community. As Sarah drove home that night, she realized that she was facing the same difficult choice that had confronted Thomas Whitmore decades earlier. She could remain silent and hope the situation resolved itself, risking the loss of something unique and valuable. Or she could take action to protect the offshore community, knowing that such action might put her own reputation in safety at risk. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah had made her decision. She would find a way to stop Coastal Heritage Development and the Maritime Phenomena Research Institute from exploiting Thomas Whitmore's secret. But first, she needed to understand exactly what they were planning and how close they were to achieving their goals. Sarah's first step was to contact someone with expertise in environmental law and marine protection. After several phone calls, she was referred to David Chin, no relation, despite the shared surname, an environmental attorney who specialized in coastal preservation issues and had successfully challenged several inappropriate development projects along the New England coast. David agreed to meet with Sarah at the library during his lunch break, curious about her description of unusual environmental concerns regarding Beacon Bay waters. Sarah had decided to present the situation in terms of protecting a sensitive marine ecosystem without initially revealing the true nature of the offshore community. David turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the intense focus of someone who had spent years fighting uphill battles against well-funded development interests. He listened carefully as Sarah described the recent survey activities and her concerns about their potential environmental impact. Coastal Heritage Development, David said, recognition evident in his voice. I've dealt with them before. They have a pattern of identifying unique natural phenomena and then building resort properties, specifically designed to commercialize those attractions. They're very good at staying within legal boundaries while completely transforming the character of the areas they develop. Is there any way to stop them if they haven't actually filed development applications yet? David shook his head grimly. Marine surveys in public waters are perfectly legal, and they're not required to reveal their ultimate intentions until they're ready to file formal development proposals. By that time, they'll have all the data they need to present a compelling case to local planning boards. But what if the area they're surveying contains something that should be protected? That's where things get complicated. Environmental protection laws are very specific about what qualifies for protection: endangered species habitats, unique geological formations, historically significant sites. Unusual light phenomena wouldn't typically qualify unless you could prove they were connected to protected marine life or ecosystems. Sarah realized she was approaching the moment when she would need to decide how much of the truth to reveal. David seemed trustworthy and genuinely committed to environmental protection, but how would he react to learning about the true nature of the offshore community? David, what if I told you that the light phenomena in this area aren't just unusual, but represent something that has never been scientifically documented before? Something that could be completely destroyed by intensive commercial activity. David leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. I'd say that if you have evidence of a previously unknown natural phenomena, there are several legal avenues we could explore. The Marine Protection Act has provisions for protecting unique marine environments, and there are federal programs designed to support research into unusual coastal phenomena. The challenge would be documenting the phenomenon sufficiently to qualify for protection. Do you have photographic evidence? Scientific measurements? Any kind of data that could support a protection application? Sarah thought about Thomas Whitmore's photographs and detailed charts, but realized that decades-old documentation might not carry much weight with modern environmental protection agencies. Some historical documentation, but nothing recent that would meet current scientific standards. Then our first step would be to conduct our own legitimate scientific study of the area, documented according to current research standards. If we can prove that something unique and valuable exists in these waters, we'll have legal grounds to challenge any development activities that might threaten it. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I know someone who might be perfect for this kind of project. Dr. Sarah Martinez is a marine biologist at the University of Maine who specializes in unusual coastal ecosystems. She's also testified as an expert witness in several environmental protection cases. If anyone could help us document and protect whatever's happening in your waters, it would be her. As David arranged a conference call with Dr. Martinez for the following day, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was building a team of experts who might be able to protect the offshore community, but she was also expanding the circle of people who knew about the phenomenon. That evening, Sarah drove out to Rocky Point again, hoping to communicate with Thomas Whitmore about the new developments. The fog was lighter than optimal for communication, but she was able to establish contact and convey the basic situation. Thomas's response was cautiously optimistic. The offshore community was willing to risk limited exposure to legitimate scientists if it meant protecting them from commercial exploitation. However, they had conditions any research would need to be conducted with respect for their nature and purpose, and the scientists involved would need to understand that they were dealing with conscious, intelligent entities rather than simple natural phenomena. Sarah asked how such understanding could be established, and Thomas's answer was both simple and complex. The scientists would need to experience direct communication with the community, just as Thomas himself and Sarah had done. The next day's conference call with Dr. Martinez went better than Sarah had dared hope. Dr. Martinez was immediately intrigued by Sarah's description of organized light patterns that appeared according to predictable conditions and seemed to respond to external stimuli. What you're describing sounds like it could be a form of collective bioluminescence I've never encountered, Dr. Martinez said. Most marine organisms that produce light do so individually or in random groups. Coordinated responsive light displays, would represent a completely new form of marine behavior. The key would be documenting the phenomenon under controlled scientific conditions. I'd need to observe the lights directly, collect water samples from the area, and use specialized equipment to measure the biochemical processes involved. Sarah hesitated, then decided to test Dr. Martinez's openness to unusual possibilities. Dr. Martinez, what would you think if the light phenomena turned out to be more complex than simple marine biology? What if they displayed characteristics that suggested ... intelligence or consciousness? There was a long pause on the phone. Finally, Dr. Martinez spoke carefully. In 30 years of marine research, I've learned to keep an open mind about what the ocean might contain. If you're suggesting that these light displays might represent some form of marine intelligence, I wouldn't dismiss the possibility out of hand. The ocean is full of surprises, and we're constantly discovering that marine life is far more sophisticated than we previously understood. But regardless of the exact nature of the phenomenon, if it's unique and potentially vulnerable to commercial exploitation, it deserves scientific study and environmental protection. David and Dr. Martinez quickly developed a plan for conducting preliminary research into the offshore lights. Dr. Martinez would come to Beacon Bay the following week with portable monitoring equipment, and they would attempt to observe and document the phenomenon under controlled conditions. If their initial findings supported the need for protection, they would file formal applications with both state and federal environmental agencies. But Sarah realized there was one more person she needed to consult before moving forward with this plan: Jake Morrison, the graduate student whose research had first alerted her to the commercial interest in the offshore lights. That afternoon, Sarah called Jake and asked if he could meet her at the library. When he arrived, she was relieved to see that he looked genuinely concerned about the situation, rather than excited about potential research opportunities. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Jake said, "and I'm starting to have serious doubts about this research grant. I tried to contact Dr. Vasquez again to ask for more details about their research objectives, and her assistant told me the project had been temporarily postponed pending review of preliminary findings." "What preliminary findings?" Sarah asked. "That's what worries me. I haven't provided them with any data yet, but they seem to think they already have enough information to make decisions about the project. It makes me wonder what other research they've been conducting in the area." Jake pulled out a folder containing printouts of satellite imagery and maritime traffic reports. "I decided to do some investigation of my own. These satellite images from the past 3 months show consistent patterns of boat activity around Rocky Point during nighttime hours. The boats appear to be maintaining positions in specific locations for extended periods. Exactly what you'd expect if someone was conducting systematic surveillance." Sarah studied the satellite images, noting that the boat positions corresponded closely to the areas where Thomas Whitma's charts indicated the offshore lights typically appeared. "Jake, I need to ask you something important. If you learned that the light phenomena you've been studying were more significant than anyone realized, possibly representing something that needed protection rather than exploitation, what would you do?" Jake didn't hesitate. "I'd do whatever I could to protect it. I became a marine biologist because I believe the ocean contains wonders we're only beginning to understand. If someone is trying to exploit or commercialize something unique and valuable that goes against everything I believe in as a scientist." Sarah made a decision. "Jake, I'd like to introduce you to some people who share your concerns. We're organizing our own research project to document and protect the phenomenon before commercial interests can exploit it. Are you interested in participating?" Over the next hour, Sarah, David, and Dr. Martinez, via phone, briefed Jake on their plan to conduct legitimate scientific research into the offshore lights. Jake's enthusiasm was evident, and his local knowledge of maritime conditions would be invaluable to their efforts. But Sarah also realized that the time for secrecy was nearly over. If their research team was going to have any success in communicating with and documenting the offshore community, she would need to reveal the full truth about Thomas Whitmore's discoveries and her own communications with the lights. That evening, as she prepared for another night of watching and waiting at Rocky Point, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since finding Thomas Whitmore's journal just a few weeks earlier. She had gone from being a quiet librarian interested in local history to becoming the leader of the team, dedicated to protecting one of the most extraordinary secrets the ocean had ever kept. But as she drove through the gathering fog toward the lighthouse, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Thomas Whitmore had protected the offshore community for over 20 years. Mrs. Hartwell had preserved his records for 3 decades. Now it was Sarah's turn to ensure that the Guardians of the Passage could continue their vital work for generations to come. The question was whether she and her unlikely team of allies could outmaneuver the commercial interests that threatened to destroy everything Thomas Whitmore had worked to protect. Asterisk.